What happens when the man who swears to protect you becomes the architect of your extinction? When the shepherd transforms into the wolf, and every scream for help only draws him closer. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. Tonight, we're delving into 4 chilling crime stories. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the nightmare that walked among them. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Thank you. They called him the Slaughterhouse Sheriff. In the forgotten stretches of New Mexico's Cimarron Territory, where the desert wind carries secrets across endless miles of dust and desolation, David Parker Ray didn't just kill. He engineered suffering with the precision of a master craftsman and the appetite of something that had abandoned its humanity long ago. For more than 4 decades, this decorated state parks officer, this father, this neighbor who waved from his driveway, operated what investigators would later describe as the most methodical torture complex ever discovered on American soil. The toy box, that's what Ray called his custom-built chamber of horrors, a soundproofed cargo trailer where screams died against insulated walls and hope evaporated under the glow of surgical lighting. Inside this mobile nightmare, authorities would discover an instrument panel that belonged in the darkest corners of medieval dungeons. Gynecological tables fitted with restraints, pulley systems designed for suspension torture, shelves lined with instruments whose purposes defied comprehension, and a collection of homemade devices engineered specifically to prolong agony. But the true terror of David Parker Ray wasn't found in his tools. It was discovered in his patience, his planning, his absolute conviction that he was entitled to transform human beings into playthings. This wasn't rage. This wasn't passion. This was cold, calculated predation refined over decades into an art form that even hardened FBI agents couldn't discuss without their voices breaking. Conservative estimates suggest at least 60 victims. 60 women who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride, taking a drink, trusting a uniform. 60 souls who entered that trailer and discovered that hell wasn't a theological concept. It was a climate-controlled space parked behind a mobile home in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. This is the story of the toy box killer, the man who proved that monsters don't lurk in shadows. They live next door, coaching little league and attending church barbecues, waiting for the moment when they can drag you into darkness so complete that even your screams become their entertainment. And the most terrifying part? He almost got away with it. November 6, 1939, brought David Parker Ray into a world that would eventually recoil from what he would become. Born in Belen, New Mexico, to an abusive father and an alcoholic mother, Ray's childhood read like a blueprint for monstrosity, but millions endure terrible childhoods without becoming predators. What separated Ray from survivors was the deliberate choice he made, somewhere along the path from boy to man, to embrace the darkness that whispered in his mind. His formative years unfolded in the harsh landscape of Truth or Consequences, a town that had renamed itself after a radio game show, trading its historical identity for a moment of publicity. The irony wasn't lost on investigators later. This place of forgotten history became home to a man who made women disappear so completely that their names faded from memory, their families left to wonder forever what darkness had swallowed them whole. Ray discovered his calling early. While other boys collected baseball cards, young David collected pornography, the violent kind, the degrading kind, the kind that depicted women not as human beings but as objects to be used and broken. He sketched elaborate diagrams of restraint systems and torture devices in notebooks that he hid beneath floorboards. He dissected animals with clinical detachment, studying how bodies worked so he could later understand how to make them stop working slowly. Military service in the 1960s gave Ray structure but didn't reform him. If anything, the discipline refined his darker impulses, teaching him patience and planning. He learned to compartmentalize, to present one face to the world while nurturing something unspeakable behind closed doors. Fellow soldiers remembered him as quiet, unremarkable, the invisible man who would prove to be the most dangerous kind of predator. By the 1970s, Ray had settled into what appeared to be an ordinary existence. He worked as a mechanic for the New Mexico Parks Department, married, divorced, married again. He fathered children who would later struggle to reconcile their memories of Saturday morning pancakes with the reality of what their father did in the darkness. He became a fixture in the community, reliable, helpful, the kind of man you'd ask to watch your house while you were away. But while David Parker Ray maintained this facade of normalcy, he was constructing his masterpiece. The toy box began as a concept scrawled in those childhood notebooks and evolved into a mobile torture chamber that demonstrated the true extent of Ray's depravity. He purchased a cargo trailer, the kind used for hauling equipment or livestock, and began its transformation with the focus of a surgeon preparing an operating theater. Every modification served a purpose. Every addition enhanced his capacity to inflict suffering. The exterior remained unremarkable, a weathered trailer that drew no attention parked behind his mobile home on Bass Road. But inside, Ray had created something that existed outside the boundaries of human experience. The walls received soundproofing insulation thick enough to swallow screams. He installed climate control because comfort mattered, his comfort, not theirs. The lighting was surgical, bright enough to ensure his victims missed nothing of what was happening to them. The centerpiece was a gynecological examination table, but this was no medical equipment. Ray had modified it extensively, adding restraints at every conceivable point: ankles, wrists, neck, waist, thighs. The table adjusted to any position, allowing for what Ray clinically referred to as access optimization. Around this altar of suffering, he arranged his instruments with the pride of a craftsman displaying his tools. Shelves lined the walls, and their contents revealed the systematic nature of Ray's evil. Whips and chains, yes, but also electrical devices, medical speculums, clamps and forceps, surgical tools, injection equipment. He built a wooden rack designed for suspension torture. He installed a mirror system ensuring his victims could watch what was being done to them. He even created homemade devices, assemblies of motors and attachments whose purposes investigators initially couldn't comprehend until their function became nightmarishly clear. But perhaps the most chilling element of the toy box was the videotaping equipment. Ray didn't just want to inflict suffering, he wanted to preserve it, to replay it, to study his technique like an athlete reviewing game footage. Investigators would later discover that Ray had compiled an extensive video library, though most of it disappeared before authorities could secure it. What remained provided glimpses into an abyss so dark that veteran detectives required counseling after viewing the material. Yet the physical space was only part of Ray's methodology. He understood that true torture began in the mind, with the destruction of hope. Every woman who entered the toy box underwent the same psychological assault. A recorded message, played through speakers as they regained consciousness from whatever drug or blow had rendered them unconscious. Ray's voice on that recording was calm, almost friendly, as he explained their situation with the tone of a tour guide describing a museum exhibit. He informed them they were now his property. He detailed in explicit language what would happen to them. He described the drugs he would use to keep them compliant but conscious. He promised that their suffering would be legendary, that they would experience things no textbook had names for. Most devastating of all, he told them about the others, the women who had occupied that same table, who had heard this same recording, who had endured and ultimately disappeared. He wanted them to understand that resistance was futile, that screaming was pointless, that no one was coming to save them because no one knew they were gone. The message ended with a promise. When he was finished with them, they would either die or be released with their memories chemically erased by drugs, unable to recall the specifics of their torment, but haunted forever by a nameless trauma that would destroy their lives just as thoroughly as murder. This was David Parker Ray's genius. He had created a system where even the survivors became ghosts, their testimony rendered unreliable by the very drugs he'd used to keep them compliant. Without bodies, without credible witnesses, without physical evidence beyond the testimony of the traumatized and disbelieved, Ray operated with near impunity for decades. And he didn't work alone. Evil, when it achieves a certain magnitude, requires infrastructure. David Parker Ray understood this fundamental truth, and over the years, He cultivated a small circle of accomplices who enabled his operations and, in some cases, participated directly in the horrors unfolding inside the toy box. His daughter, Glenda Jean Jessie Ray, became perhaps his most effective recruiter. Pretty, personable, and utterly devoid of the moral constraints that prevent most people from selling other human beings into torture, Jessie trolled bars and truck stops across New Mexico and Arizona, identifying vulnerable women, hitchhikers, sex workers, addicts, runaways, anyone whose disappearance might not trigger immediate police response. She played the role perfectly. The friendly woman offering a ride, a place to crash, a sympathetic ear. These women, many of them desperate and marginalized, saw Jessie as a lifeline. They couldn't have known that this smiling savior was delivering them directly into her father's hands like sacrificial offerings to a dark god who wore a mechanic's coveralls and smiled at neighbors while planning atrocities. Witness testimony later revealed Jessie's active participation in the torture sessions themselves. She didn't just recruit, she engaged, inflicting her own cruelties with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her calling. Investigators theorized that Jessie sought her father's approval through participation in his depravities, creating a cycle of abuse and validation that bound them together in their crimes. Then there was Cindy Hendy, Ray's girlfriend and perhaps the most enthusiastic participant in his nightmare factory. Hendy, who moved in with Ray in 1999, embraced her role with terrifying zeal. She assisted in abductions, participated in torture sessions, and helped dispose of evidence. More than that, she seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. Psychological evaluations later suggested Hendy suffered from severe self-esteem issues and found validation in Ray's attention. By participating in his fantasies, by becoming indispensable to his operations, she secured a place in his life. The cost was complicity in unspeakable crimes, but for Hendy, that price seemed acceptable. She had finally found somewhere she belonged, even if that place was a blood-spattered torture chamber parked behind a mobile home. Dennis Roy Yancey represented another variety of accomplice, the protege. Yancey, significantly younger than Ray, regarded the older man as a mentor figure. Ray had groomed Yancey carefully, introducing him gradually to his activities, testing boundaries, ensuring loyalty before revealing the full extent of his operations. Yancey's role evolved from observer to participant, culminating in an act that would ultimately contribute to Ray's downfall. In 1997, Yancey kidnapped Marie Parker, a 22-year-old woman, and brought her to the toy box. What followed was a prolonged torture session that ended with Parker's murder. Yancey strangling her on Ray's explicit instructions. They disposed of Parker's body in Elephant Butte Lake, where it remained undiscovered for years. But Yancey's conscience, such as it was, eventually cracked. The weight of what he'd done would later drive him to confess, providing investigators with the first confirmed murder linked to Ray's operations. The final piece of Ray's support system was his longtime friend Roy Yancey, Dennis's father, who provided alibis, storage space, and disposal assistance. The elder Yancey never directly participated in torture sessions, but his willingness to ask no questions and provide logistical support made him complicit in Ray's crimes. He represented the banality of evil, the ordinary person who enables extraordinary monstrosity through willful ignorance and passive cooperation. Together, these accomplices formed a network that sustained Ray's operations for decades. They hunted, they participated, they cleaned up, they kept secrets. Each served a function in the machine Ray had built for the industrial-scale processing of human suffering. But understanding the support network only deepens the horror when examining what actually happened inside the toy box. Ray's methodology was brutally systematic. Victims were typically drugged during abduction, often with a combination of sedatives and hallucinogens that left them conscious but disoriented. Upon arrival at the property, they were transferred into the trailer and secured to the examination table. As the drugs wore off enough to restore awareness, Ray would initiate the orientation process. The recorded message, followed by a personal introduction that reinforced their helplessness. Then the torture began. Survivors who eventually came forward, their memories fragmented by drugs and trauma, described sessions that lasted hours, sometimes days. Ray worked methodically, documenting reactions, testing different combinations of pain and humiliation, treating his victims like laboratory subjects in a study only a damaged mind could conceive. He used electrical shocks applied to sensitive areas. He employed instruments designed to cause pain without leaving obvious external marks. He administered drugs that heightened sensitivity to pain while preventing unconsciousness. He understood human physiology well enough to keep victims on the edge of collapse without allowing them the escape of passing out. The psychological torture proved equally devastating. Ray talked throughout his sessions, sometimes clinically describing what he was doing and why, other times sharing detailed accounts of previous victims and what had become of them. He would tell women about their predecessors who had occupied that same table, who had screamed the same desperate pleas, who had ultimately either died or been dumped somewhere with their memories scrambled by drugs. Some victims he kept for days, moving them between the trailer and a separate bedroom in his house that he'd converted into another torture space. He rotated between different forms of abuse, preventing adaptation, ensuring that each session brought fresh horrors. Food and water were provided intermittently, enough to sustain life, not enough to restore strength. When Ray decided he was finished with a victim, the disposal method varied. Some women were murdered outright, strangled, suffocated, or killed through methods that left minimal evidence. Their bodies were weighted and dumped in Elephant Butte Lake, or buried in the vast desert expanses surrounding Truth or Consequences, or dissolved in barrels of acid that Ray kept for that purpose. Other victims were drugged heavily with a combination of sedatives and sodium pentothal, then dumped alive in remote locations. Ray calculated that between the drugs and the trauma, these women would be unable to provide coherent statements to police. Even if they reported the crimes, the combination of memory loss and physical trauma would make their testimony seem unreliable. He was right. Over the years, several women did come forward with fragmented accounts of being held captive and tortured. But without physical evidence, without clear memories, without the ability to identify locations or provide consistent timelines, their reports went nowhere. Police filed them as drug-related delusions or attention-seeking fabrications. David Parker Ray had created the perfect crime, repeatable, sustainable, virtually undetectable. He could torture and kill with impunity because he'd engineered every aspect of his operation to prevent exposure. By 1999, conservative estimates suggested Ray had victimized at least 60 women over a period exceeding 40 years. The true number might never be known. Many victims were transient people whose disappearances triggered no missing persons reports. Others were released alive but so thoroughly broken that they couldn't or wouldn't come forward. The toy box represented 40 years of refinement, of learning from mistakes, of perfecting technique. It was the culmination of David Parker Ray's life's work, a testament to what happens when intelligence, patience, and absolute moral bankruptcy converge in a single human being. But every system, no matter how carefully constructed, contains the seeds of its own destruction. For Ray, that seed was named Cynthia Vigil. March 22, 1999, began like any other day for David Parker Ray. Another opportunity to indulge the appetites that had defined his existence for 4 decades. But before the sun set on that date, a single act of desperate courage would begin the unraveling of everything Ray had built. Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old sex worker, had been held captive in the toy box for 3 days. 3 days of systematic torture. 3 days of hearing Ray's calm voice explaining precisely what he was doing and why. 3 days of enduring pain calibrated to keep her conscious and aware through every moment of her degradation. But Vigil possessed something Ray hadn't encountered before, an absolute refusal to accept her fate. While other victims had broken under the psychological and physical assault, Vigil's determination hardened. She studied her captors, watched for patterns, waited for opportunity. That opportunity arrived when Cindy Hendy made a critical mistake. On that March afternoon, Ray left the property to run errands, leaving Hendy alone to watch their captive. Hendy, perhaps grown complacent after years of victims who never fought back, grew careless. She left the toy box briefly, and in that moment Vigil saw her chance. The ice pick, one of Ray's instruments, lay within reach. Vigil, despite her restraints, despite the drugs still clouding her system, despite 3 days of torture that would have destroyed most people's will to resist, stretched until her fingers closed around the handle. When Hendy returned, Vigil was ready. She struck, driving the ice pick into Hendy's side with all the strength her damaged body could summon. Hendy screamed and stumbled backward, and Vigil, moving with the desperate energy of someone who understood this was her only chance, freed herself from the remaining restraints and ran. She ran wearing only an iron collar that Ray had locked around her neck. She ran with her body marked by days of torture. She ran with ice pick in hand, through the door, into the daylight, onto Bass Road, screaming for help. A driver saw her. A woman, naked except for the collar, blood streaming from various wounds, eyes wild with terror and determination, screaming that she'd been tortured, that she'd escaped, that someone needed to call the police. The driver, shocked but responsive, pulled over. In those crucial minutes, while the driver called 911, Hendy emerged from the property and attempted to recapture Vigil. But the survivor fought back with the ice pick, keeping Hendy at bay while sirens approached in the distance. When officers from the Sierra County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found a scene that initially defied comprehension. Vigil, still wearing the collar, trying to explain through tears and trauma that she'd been held prisoner and tortured. Hendy, bleeding from the ice pick wound, claiming Vigil was a mentally unstable woman who'd attacked her. And behind them, the innocuous-looking trailer that contained nightmares. The responding officers, faced with two conflicting stories, made the decision to investigate. What they found inside the toy box would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The door opened onto hell meticulously organized. The examination table with its array of restraints. The instruments arranged on shelves. The video equipment. The soundproofing. The mirror system. The surgical lighting. And everywhere, the subtle markers of recent use, blood traces, discarded drug paraphernalia, Vigil's clothing. One officer, a 20-year veteran, stepped outside and vomited. Another stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. A third immediately called for backup and FBI notification because this clearly exceeded local jurisdiction. Within hours, Bass Road became a crime scene unlike any these investigators had encountered. FBI agents arrived from the Albuquerque field office. Evidence technicians began the painstaking process of documenting and cataloging every item in the toy box. Detectives started piecing together the scope of what they'd uncovered. David Parker Ray, when located and arrested, showed no emotion. No fear, no shame, no recognition that his world was ending. He simply invoked his right to an attorney and stopped talking. Cindy Hendy, injured and facing serious charges, initially maintained her innocence, but her story crumbled under interrogation. Within days, Hendy agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, providing details about the operations that confirmed investigators' worst suspicions. She described the recruitment process, the torture sessions, the disposal methods. She named other accomplices, including Jesse Ray and Dennis Roy Yancey. She discussed the number of victims in terms that made experienced FBI agents pale. The investigation expanded rapidly. Divers searched Elephant Butte Lake, recovering bone fragments and personal items that might belong to victims. Cadaver dogs swept the desert around Ray's property. Forensic teams processed the toy box inch by inch, finding DNA evidence, traces of blood that matched no known victims, hair samples, fibers. All the microscopic remnants of crimes committed over decades. Meanwhile, investigators began the heartbreaking process of identifying possible victims. They compiled lists of missing women from New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. Anyone who had disappeared near locations where Ray was known to travel. They reached out to sex workers, showing them photographs of Ray, Hendy, and Jesse, asking if anyone recognized them or had heard stories about a man who abducted women. Slowly, survivors began to emerge from the shadows. Women who had experienced fragments of memories, being in a trailer, being tortured, waking up in the desert with no clear recollection of how they'd gotten there. The drugs Ray had used to erase their memories had worked partially but not perfectly, leaving behind nightmare images that these women had tried for years to dismiss as delusions. Kelly Garrett came forward, describing an abduction from 1996. Angelica Montano recounted being drugged and tortured in 1989. Each survivor's testimony added details to the emerging picture of Ray's methodology and the scope of his crimes. The media descended on truth or consequences like locusts. National news crews set up outside Ray's property. Reporters interviewed neighbors who expressed shock. He seemed so normal, so helpful. The refrain repeated in every case where monsters hide behind ordinary facades. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators found Ray's written materials. He had kept journals, detailed accounts of his fantasies and activities. He had drawn diagrams of torture devices he wanted to build. He had compiled victim lists, though many names were incomplete or illegible, suggesting that even Ray couldn't remember everyone he'd hurt. One document in particular captured the systematic nature of Ray's evil. A training manual he'd created for potential accomplices, detailing his methodology, his techniques, his philosophy of victim selection and disposal. It read like a technical manual for industrial-scale torture, written in the same matter-of-fact tone an engineer might use to describe manufacturing processes. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit estimated, based on the evidence and Ray's own records, that he had likely victimized between 40 and 60 women, possibly more. They noted that Ray represented an unusual category of serial killer, one motivated not primarily by the act of killing but by the process of torture itself. Death was simply disposal of used materials, not the goal. Prosecutors began preparing their case, understanding they faced significant challenges. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the torture facility and the testimony of survivors, they had limited physical evidence connecting Ray to specific murders. Bodies remained unrecovered. Many victims remained unidentified. The cases would rely heavily on survivor testimony from women whose memories had been deliberately damaged by drugs and trauma. Nevertheless, authorities charged Ray with multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and torture. Cindy Hendy faced similar charges. Jesse Ray and Dennis Roy Yancey were indicted as accomplices. The legal machinery began its slow grind toward justice. For Cynthia Vigil, the woman whose courage and determination had finally stopped David Parker Ray, the aftermath brought its own challenges. She struggled with PTSD, with guilt about the victims who hadn't escaped, with the knowledge that her testimony would be dissected by defense attorneys seeking to discredit her. But she also understood something profound. She had survived. And in surviving, in fighting back, in refusing to let Ray's torture break her will, she had become the instrument of his downfall. Every woman he had victimized before her deserved justice. Every potential future victim had been spared. The toy box would never claim another life. As Ray sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators continued their work, knowing that each piece of evidence, each identified victim, each confirmed detail brought them closer to ensuring this monster would never walk free again. The legal proceedings against David Parker Ray unfolded with agonizing slowness. Each delay and continuance another wound for survivors and families desperate for closure. The case presented unique challenges for prosecutors. Overwhelming evidence of torture capacity but limited physical proof of specific murders. Survivors whose testimony defense attorneys would inevitably attack as unreliable due to drug-induced memory loss. The state of New Mexico decided to prosecute Ray on the strongest available charges: the kidnapping and torture of Cynthia Vigil, Kelly Garrett, and Angelica Montano. These women could testify directly about their experiences, and their abductions occurred recently enough that physical evidence remained viable. Cindy Hendy's trial began first in April 2000. Her cooperation with investigators had earned her a plea deal, testimony against Ray in exchange for a reduced sentence. Hendy took the stand and provided chilling details about the operations inside the toy box, confirming the systematic nature of Ray's crimes and her own enthusiastic participation. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before convicting Hendy on all counts. She received a sentence of 36 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving half. Victim advocates and prosecutors considered this inadequate given the scope of her crimes, but the plea agreement was binding. Jesse Ray faced trial separately on charges related to recruiting victims. Evidence demonstrated she had lured multiple women to her father's property, knowing precisely what awaited them. In 2001, she was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. She served less than half before being released on parole, a fact that generated outrage among survivors and victim advocacy groups. Dennis Roy Yancey, who had confessed to murdering Marie Parker under Ray's direction, accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Ray. He received a sentence of 2 consecutive 15-year terms. His cooperation provided investigators with their only confirmed murder victim, though Parker's body remained unrecovered from Elephant Butte Lake. Then came David Parker Ray's turn to face justice. His trial began in March 2000, with jury selection alone consuming weeks. The prosecution needed jurors who could handle the disturbing evidence without becoming so overwhelmed they couldn't function. Defense attorneys sought anyone who might harbor doubts about survivor testimony or question the reliability of drug-affected memories. The evidence presentation lasted months. Survivors testified in excruciating detail about their ordeals, forced to relive trauma while defense attorneys cross-examined them aggressively, highlighting any inconsistencies in their accounts, emphasizing the drugs in their systems, suggesting their memories might be unreliable. Cynthia Vigil proved to be an unshakable witness. Despite defense attempts to discredit her, despite the emotional toll of recounting her torture, she maintained her composure and provided clear, consistent testimony. She described Ray's methods, his demeanor during torture sessions, the layout of the toy box, details that investigators had confirmed independently. Kelly Garrett testified about her 1996 abduction and the fragmented memories that had haunted her for years, memories that made terrible sense once she learned about Ray's arrest. Angelica Montano, whose ordeal dated back to 1989, described how Ray's torture had destroyed her life, leaving her with PTSD so severe she could barely function. The prosecution introduced the physical evidence: photographs of the toy box interior, the instruments Ray had collected, the restraint systems, the video equipment. They played portions of Ray's orientation recording, the tape he had used to psychologically break his victims, and several jurors visibly recoiled at the calm, matter-of-fact tone in which Ray described what he planned to do to the women strapped to his table. Expert witnesses testified about the sophistication of Ray's operation, the deliberate planning evident in every aspect of the toy box's design. Psychologists explained how the combination of drugs and trauma could affect memory without completely erasing it. FBI agents detailed their investigation and the estimated scope of Ray's crimes. The defense strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt. Ray's attorneys argued that while the toy box was disturbing, it represented consensual BDSM activities between adults, not criminal torture. They highlighted the drug use among several victims, suggesting their testimony was unreliable. They pointed to the absence of murder victims or bodies, implying the prosecution's claims about the scope of Ray's crimes were speculative. This defense strategy proved difficult for survivors to endure. Watching defense attorneys characterize their torture as consensual activity, hearing their credibility attacked, seeing Ray sit emotionless at the defense table while lawyers suggested they were liars or delusional. After months of testimony, the case went to the jury in May 2000. For 2 weeks, jurors deliberated, reviewing evidence, requesting transcript readbacks, struggling with the weight of what they'd heard and seen. The trial had taken a visible toll on them. Several appeared to have lost weight. Many looked exhausted. Some had been observed crying during testimony. Then, before a verdict could be reached, disaster struck. A juror came forward with concerns about potential misconduct by another juror. The allegation suggested this juror had been discussing the case outside the courtroom, violating the judge's explicit instructions. After investigation, the judge declared a mistrial. The news devastated survivors and prosecutors. Months of painful testimony, of reliving trauma, of hoping for justice, all seemingly wasted. A new trial would be necessary, meaning survivors would have to testify again, face cross-examination again, watch Ray's emotionless face again. Before the second trial could begin, prosecutors and defense attorneys negotiated. Ray, now 61 years old and facing the prospect of another lengthy trial, agreed to a plea deal. He would plead guilty to multiple counts of kidnapping and torture in exchange for a sentence that would effectively keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. In September 2001, Ray stood before the court and admitted his guilt. He showed no remorse, no emotion, treating the proceedings as a formality. The judge sentenced him to 224 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Additional charges in other jurisdictions added more time, ensuring Ray would die behind bars. For survivors, the plea deal brought mixed emotions. Relief that they wouldn't have to testify again. Frustration that Ray had avoided a full public accounting of his crimes. Satisfaction that he would never walk free. Grief for the victims who would never see justice because their cases couldn't be proven. David Parker Ray was transferred to New Mexico State Penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. Prison officials placed him in protective custody, understanding that his crimes made him a target for violence from other inmates. He settled into the routine of prison life, reading, maintaining correspondence with a small group of supporters who believed in his innocence despite his guilty plea. Then, on May 28, 2002, less than a year into his sentence, David Parker Ray suffered a fatal heart attack. He died at the age of 62, taking to his grave the identities of dozens of victims, the locations of bodies, the full extent of his crimes. News of his death generated complex reactions. Some survivors felt cheated. Ray had escaped decades of imprisonment, had died relatively quickly rather than suffering for years. Others felt relief that he was gone, that the possibility of parole hearings or appeals had ended permanently. Victim advocates noted the bitter irony. Ray had engineered suffering to last as long as possible for his victims, but his own suffering had been brief. The investigation into Ray's crimes continued after his death. FBI agents kept working to identify victims, to locate remains, to provide closure for families. Divers continued searching Elephant Butte Lake. Forensic teams analyzed evidence collected from the toy box and Ray's property. Over the years, investigators have confirmed connections between Ray and several missing women. Though without recoverable bodies, these remain circumstantial. The FBI maintains an active case file, periodically releasing information in hopes that new witnesses or evidence will emerge. Elephant Butte Lake, where Ray dumped many of his victims, occasionally yields grim discoveries. Bone fragments, personal items. But the vast reservoir's size and depth make systematic recovery nearly impossible. Somewhere in those depths rest the remains of women whose names might never be known, whose families might never receive answers. The toy box itself was destroyed after the trial concluded, cut apart and incinerated to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction. The property on Bass Road eventually sold, with new owners attempting to build normal lives in a place forever marked by horror. Truth or Consequences struggled with its association with Ray's crimes. A town that had renamed itself for publicity now found itself famous for hosting one of America's most prolific torture murderers. Local officials worked to move past the stigma, to rebuild the community's reputation, but the shadow of the toy box killer proved difficult to escape. For survivors, the aftermath brought varying outcomes. Cynthia Vigil became an advocate for victims' rights, using her experience to help others navigate trauma recovery. Some survivors disappeared from public view, seeking privacy to heal away from media attention. Others struggled with addiction and mental health issues, the trauma of their ordeals manifesting in self-destructive behaviors. Mental health professionals who worked with Ray's victims noted the unusual nature of their trauma. Not just the physical torture, but the psychological assault of knowing they were one among many, that Ray had refined his techniques over decades, that they had survived only because they fit his criteria for release rather than murder. The case prompted changes in how law enforcement handles reports from sex workers and other marginalized populations. Too many of Ray's victims had tried to report their abductions only to be dismissed as unreliable witnesses. Departments across the country revised protocols, training officers to take such reports seriously regardless of the victim's background. David Parker Ray's legacy is measured in destroyed lives, in families that never received closure, in women who survived but carry scars that will never fully heal. Conservative estimates suggest at least 60 victims over more than 40 years. The true number died with Ray. The toy box killer proved that evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. It lives next door, waves from the driveway, helps neighbors with car repairs, coaches Little League. It wears an ordinary face and plans extraordinary horrors in soundproof trailers where screams die against insulated walls. And the most terrifying truth? David Parker Ray operated for 4 decades before a single woman's desperate courage finally stopped him. How many others like him remain undetected, refining their methods, perfecting their systems, transforming human beings into statistics that might never be compiled? The toy box is gone, its architect dead, but the questions remain. The nightmares continue, and somewhere in the depths of Elephant Butte Lake, silent witnesses rest, waiting for a justice that may never come. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The marriage bed that became a tomb. Blood doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it whispers through surgical precision while a husband watches the clock. We're diving into a case where love letters turned into death warrants, where wedding vows became a countdown to murder. Monroe Betterton didn't just kill his wife. He orchestrated her disappearance with the cold calculation of a man who believed he'd committed the perfect crime. But monsters who think they're clever often forget one thing. The dead have a way of speaking, even from shallow graves. Jennifer Betterton never saw the trap closing around her throat. February 2022 arrived in Staunton, Virginia, with the kind of bitter cold that makes bones ache and soil hard as concrete. The perfect conditions for a man planning to bury evidence. Monroe Betterton, a 58-year-old husband of 26 years, had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone could have imagined. His wife Jennifer, 51, vibrant and trusting, moved through her daily routines completely unaware that her marriage had become a death sentence. The Bettertons appeared unremarkable to their neighbors. Monroe worked steadily, maintained their property, and played the role of devoted husband with practiced ease. Jennifer, cheerful and kind-hearted, spoke often of their shared history, the decades they'd spent building a life together. She believed in the permanence of their bond, in the sanctity of the promises they'd made. That belief would cost her everything. But beneath Monroe's mask of normalcy festered something rotten. Financial pressures had been mounting. Monroe's careful facade had begun developing cracks, and Jennifer, smart, observant Jennifer, had started noticing inconsistencies. Money disappeared from accounts. Explanations didn't quite align with reality. The man she'd trusted with her life had been systematically deceiving her, and worse, he knew she was beginning to see through the lies. For Monroe, Jennifer had transformed from wife to liability, from partner to problem requiring permanent solution. He began his planning with chilling methodicalness. This wouldn't be a crime of passion, no spontaneous eruption of violence. Monroe approached murder the way accountants approach tax returns, with detailed preparation and careful attention to covering every angle. He studied her patterns, noted her vulnerabilities, calculated the optimal timing. Every conversation became reconnaissance. Every kind gesture concealed reconnaissance gathering. Jennifer sensed something shifting in their home's atmosphere. That intuition women develop after years of marriage, that subtle recognition when energy changes, began whispering warnings she couldn't quite articulate. She mentioned feeling uneasy to friends, described Monroe seeming distant, distracted. But she attributed these sensations to stress, to financial worries, to anything except the horrifying truth. Her husband was preparing to erase her from existence. February 9th dawned gray and merciless. Monroe had chosen this date with purpose. He'd arranged his schedule, ensured privacy, created the space needed for murder without interruption. Jennifer woke that morning to what she believed was another ordinary day. Perhaps they shared coffee. Perhaps Monroe smiled at her across the breakfast table, performing normalcy one final time. Perhaps Jennifer felt that unease again, that whisper of wrongness she'd learned to dismiss. What happened in those final hours remains partially obscured by Monroe's carefully constructed lies, but the evidence paints a nightmarish picture. Jennifer didn't die quickly. Monroe didn't grant her the mercy of sudden, unexpected death. Instead, she endured. She fought. She realized, in those final terrifying moments, exactly what her husband had become. The house that had sheltered their marriage for decades became an abattoir. Monroe attacked with brutal determination, using methods designed to overpower and silence. Jennifer's blood marked floors, walls, surfaces that Monroe would later scrub with obsessive thoroughness. She called out, perhaps pleading, perhaps screaming. No one heard. No one came. Monroe had ensured complete isolation for his atrocity. When Jennifer finally fell silent, Monroe's work had only begun. He wrapped her cooling body with the detached efficiency of someone removing garbage. No tears. No remorse. No pause to consider the woman he'd spent 26 years beside, the person who'd trusted him absolutely. Jennifer became nothing more than evidence requiring disposal, a problem solved through violence and ready for concealment. Monroe had prepared a grave beforehand, chosen carefully on their property where soil might accept what he needed to hide. He'd selected a spot away from casual observation, somewhere the earth could swallow his crime and keep it buried. As darkness gathered that February evening, Monroe carried Jennifer's body outside. The cold air bit exposed skin. The ground resisted his shovel. Nothing about murder is easy, despite what killers imagine during planning stages. He dug until exhaustion made his muscles scream. Then he lowered Jennifer into the earth that would become her tomb. Her face, once animated with life and laughter, now stared sightless at the Virginia sky. Monroe piled soil onto her body, covering her inch by inch, erasing her physical presence from the world. Each shovelful represented another lie, another layer of deception he'd need to maintain. When he finished, Monroe stood over the disturbed earth, breathing heavily from exertion. Did he feel satisfaction, relief, or was there some flicker of recognition that he'd destroyed not just Jennifer but himself, that this moment would define his existence forever after? He returned to the house and began cleaning. Blood is remarkably persistent. It seeps into grout, stains porous surfaces, leaves traces invisible to eyes but unmistakable to forensic examination. Monroe scrubbed for hours, working with increasing desperation as dawn approached. He needed the house presentable, needed to erase every indication of violence, needed to create the stage for his next performance. Because Monroe had a story prepared. Jennifer hadn't been murdered, she'd left. Simply walked away from their marriage, abandoned their life together, vanished of her own accord. He'd tell friends, family, authorities that Jennifer had grown unhappy, restless, determined to start fresh elsewhere. People left marriages all the time. No one would question it too closely. He'd mourn appropriately, express confusion and hurt, play the abandoned husband with the same skill he'd played the devoted partner. But Monroe underestimated one crucial element. Jennifer had people who loved her, people who knew her heart, people who would never accept the narrative he crafted. When Jennifer's family and friends began asking questions, Monroe stuck to his script. She'd left. He didn't know where. Yes, it was sudden. Yes, he was devastated. He performed grief with practiced expressions and carefully measured words. But those who truly knew Jennifer recognized the dissonance immediately. She wouldn't disappear without contact, wouldn't abandon relationships that meant everything to her, wouldn't leave without explanation. Their skepticism became suspicion. Suspicion became investigation. And investigation would ultimately transform Monroe from grieving husband to cornered killer, from confident deceiver to desperate fugitive. Because while Monroe had planned Jennifer's murder meticulously, he'd failed to account for the most powerful force in true crime. People who refuse to forget, who demand answers, who won't let the dead remain silent. Jennifer's grave held her body, but her voice, the relationships she'd nurtured, the love she'd inspired, the concern she'd confided, would speak louder than any lie Monroe could construct. The monster thought he'd won. He'd thought surgical planning and cold execution guaranteed success. But he'd miscalculated fatally. Jennifer's death wasn't an ending Monroe controlled. It was a beginning of exposure, of justice, of consequences converging with inexorable certainty. Jennifer's absence screamed louder than any presence ever could. Within days of her supposed departure, those who knew her intimately recognized something fundamentally wrong with Monroe's explanation. Jennifer didn't operate on impulse. She planned, communicated, maintained connections with religious devotion. The idea that she'd simply vanished without word to family, without contact with close friends, without accessing her own financial accounts, it defied everything about her character. Her family mobilized immediately. Phone calls multiplied, questions sharpened. Monroe found himself subjected to increasing scrutiny, forced to repeat his story again and again to people who believed it less with each retelling. He maintained his performance initially, but cracks appeared in his facade. Details didn't align perfectly. His timeline contained inconsistencies. His emotional responses seemed calculated rather than genuine. Lisa Betterton, Jennifer's sister-in-law, became particularly vocal in her disbelief. She knew Jennifer as intimately as family allows, understood her patterns and priorities, recognized immediately that abandonment contradicted Jennifer's fundamental nature. Lisa pressed Monroe for specifics. Where did Jennifer go? Why hadn't she contacted anyone? What precipitated this sudden decision? Monroe's answers remained vague, evasive, increasingly desperate. Lisa contacted authorities, filing a missing person report that transformed Jennifer's disappearance from family drama to official investigation. The Staunton Police Department assigned detectives who began examining Monroe's claims with professional skepticism. Missing person cases often involve voluntary departure, but certain elements raised immediate red flags. No financial activity, no phone usage, no digital footprint whatsoever. Jennifer hadn't just left. She'd apparently evaporated from existence entirely. Detectives arrived at the Betterton residence to interview Monroe formally. He greeted them with forced cooperation, maintaining his story while projecting wounded confusion. Jennifer had left. He didn't know why or where. Yes, their marriage had experienced stress, but nothing warranting abandonment. He presented himself as victim, the spouse betrayed and bewildered by incomprehensible behavior. But investigators recognized performance when confronted with it. Years of experience taught them to identify deception's subtle indicators, the microexpressions flickering across faces, the strategic pauses before answers, the carefully neutral tone concealing calculation. Monroe exhibited all these tells and more. Detectives left the interview convinced they were investigating not a missing person case, but a homicide where the victim remained undiscovered. They requested permission to search the property. Monroe hesitated, a crucial mistake. Innocent people typically welcome searches, eager to eliminate themselves as suspects, desperate for any action that might locate their missing loved one. Monroe's reluctance broadcast guilt louder than any confession. He eventually consented, calculating that refusal would appear more suspicious than agreement, believing his cleanup had been thorough enough to withstand inspection. He was catastrophically wrong. Forensic specialists descended on the Betterton home with equipment designed to reveal what cleaners hoped to conceal. Luminol spray transformed the house into a constellation of blue glowing evidence. Blood traces emerged from grout Monroe had scrubbed raw. Spatter patterns told stories of violence and desperate cleaning. Cadaver dogs indicated areas of interest with behavior that froze Monroe's manufactured composure. Outside, ground-penetrating radar identified disturbances in the yard's soil. Freshly turned earth, inconsistent density, anomalies suggesting recent excavation. all pointing toward the spot where Monroe had buried his wife. Investigators marked the location, prepared search warrants, assembled the resources needed to exhume whatever secrets the ground concealed. Monroe watched his carefully constructed lies disintegrate in real time. The confidence that had sustained him through planning and execution eroded under forensic scrutiny's unforgiving glare. He understood that discovery loomed inevitable, that Jennifer's body would emerge from its shallow grave, that physical evidence would contradict every claim he'd made. So, Monroe ran. On February 22nd, less than 2 weeks after murdering his wife, Monroe Betterton became a fugitive. He abandoned the house where he'd killed Jennifer, fled the jurisdiction before authorities could arrest him, transformed from suspect under surveillance to wanted criminal. His flight eliminated any remaining doubt about guilt. Innocent people don't run from investigation. Police issued warrants for Monroe's arrest on charges of second-degree murder. His face appeared on news broadcasts throughout Virginia and beyond. The case that had begun as family concern and police investigation exploded into regional manhunt. Monroe had assumed his planning guaranteed success, but he'd never prepared for this scenario. Exposed, hunted, scrambling to avoid capture. Meanwhile, investigators returned to the Betterton property with excavation equipment. The spot indicated by ground-penetrating radar became the focus of careful, systematic digging. Forensic technicians worked methodically, removing soil layer by layer, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. The earth yielded reluctantly, holding tight to what Monroe had forced it to accept. Then they found her. Jennifer's body emerged from the cold Virginia ground 13 days after her husband had placed her there. She lay curled in the makeshift grave, still wearing the clothes she died in, evidence of violence marking her remains. The sight devastated the investigators who'd worked tirelessly to locate her. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was a woman who'd been loved, a person whose life had been stolen through betrayal and brutality. Medical examiners transported Jennifer's body for autopsy. The examination revealed the horror of her final moments. Blunt force trauma, evidence of struggle, injuries consistent with sustained assault. Jennifer had fought for her life. She'd resisted her husband's attack with desperate strength. But Monroe's size advantage and premeditated violence had overwhelmed her defenses. The autopsy painted a nightmare picture of trust destroyed and life extinguished through intimate violence. While Jennifer's remains underwent examination, the manhunt for Monroe intensified. Police distributed his photograph widely, contacted known associates, monitored financial accounts and phone records for any indication of his location. Tips flooded in from the public. Possible sightings, secondhand information, speculation about where he might have fled. Each lead required investigation. Resources diverted to tracking a killer who'd proven himself capable of both meticulous planning and panicked improvisation. Monroe had prepared for murder but not for flight. His escape lacked the careful organization that had characterized his crime. He'd grabbed essentials and fled without comprehensive strategy, operating on desperation rather than design. This impulsiveness would prove his undoing. Jennifer's family received confirmation of what they'd already known. Their beloved sister, daughter, friend hadn't abandoned them voluntarily. She'd been murdered by the man she'd trusted most absolutely. The grief was compounded by betrayal, by recognition that Monroe had spent 26 years beside Jennifer while harboring capacity for her destruction. How long had he contemplated killing her? When did his feelings transform from affection to murderous calculation? These questions haunted those who'd known them as a couple. Neighbors recalled pleasant interactions with both Bettertons. Friends remembered dinners and celebrations shared. Nothing in their public presentation suggested the horror festering beneath surface normalcy. Monroe had maintained his mask with disturbing effectiveness, revealing his true nature only when he deemed Jennifer expendable. The community reeled from revelation. Staunton, Virginia, wasn't immune to crime, but intimate partner homicide always shocks, especially when the killer attempts elaborate concealment. People who'd lived near the Bettertons for years suddenly questioned their own judgment, wondered how they'd missed signs of Monroe's malevolence, felt complicity through ignorance. But recognition of evil isn't always possible when killers specialize in deception. Monroe had spent decades perfecting his performance. Only Jennifer had glimpsed what lurked beneath his facade, and she dismissed her intuition until too late. Her death served as grim reminder that danger often wears familiar faces, that monsters don't announce themselves with obvious indicators. As February turned to March, pressure mounted on Monroe with each passing day. His face appeared everywhere: news broadcasts, social media, wanted posters distributed throughout the region. Every interaction risked recognition. Every public appearance gambled on remaining anonymous. The resources available to fugitives without preparation are severely limited. Monroe couldn't access his accounts without detection, couldn't contact associates without surveillance, couldn't maintain freedom indefinitely against organized pursuit. The walls were closing. Jennifer's discovery had transformed this from missing person case to confirmed homicide with identified perpetrator. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive clear, the timeline established. All that remained was capturing the killer who'd thought himself clever enough to escape consequences. Monroe had murdered his wife, believing he'd planned perfectly. But he'd underestimated the people who loved Jennifer, the investigators who refused to accept convenient lies, the forensic science that revealed truth despite desperate attempts at concealment. Jennifer might be dead, but her voice echoed through evidence and testimony, through family determination and police persistence, through physical proof that contradicted every word Monroe had spoken. She would have justice. The only question remaining was when, and how desperately Monroe would struggle against the inevitable. 27 days of freedom is all Monroe Bedtime managed to steal. While he remained at large, investigators worked exhaustively to construct the case that would convict him. Jennifer's body provided crucial physical evidence: autopsy results confirming homicide, forensic analysis linking her death to the house she'd shared with Monroe, timeline establishing that she'd died precisely when Monroe claimed she'd left voluntarily. Every detail demolished his story, replaced his fiction with documented fact. The forensic examination of the Bedtime home yielded overwhelming evidence. Despite Monroe's frantic cleaning, blood evidence persisted in locations he'd missed or inadequately treated. DNA confirmed Jennifer's identity. Spatter patterns indicated the violence's location and intensity. The house itself testified against Monroe with scientific certainty that no jury could dismiss. Investigators also examined digital evidence, phone records, computer history, financial transactions. They discovered Monroe's growing desperation in the months preceding Jennifer's murder. Debt accumulation, suspicious searches, communications suggesting increasing stress. While planning a murder, Monroe had left digital breadcrumbs pointing directly toward premeditation and intent. But evidence means nothing if the perpetrator evades capture indefinitely. The manhunt continued with escalating urgency. Every day Monroe remained free was another day Jennifer's family waited for closure. Another day he might flee beyond reach. Another day justice remained unserved. Monroe's photograph saturated media coverage throughout Virginia and surrounding states. The U.S. Marshals Service joined the search, bringing additional resources and expertise to fugitive pursuit. They analyzed Monroe's background, identified potential destinations, monitored locations where he might seek refuge. The investigation suggested Monroe hadn't fled far, probably remaining within the broader region, hoping proximity would somehow aid his survival as a fugitive. This proved accurate. On March 8, 2022, U.S. Marshals received intelligence placing Monroe in Campbell County, Virginia, roughly 70 miles from the home where he'd murdered his wife. The tip came from vigilant citizens who'd recognized Monroe from widespread media coverage. He'd been attempting to maintain low profile, avoiding public exposure, operating on cash and desperation. Marshals moved swiftly to prevent another escape. They coordinated with local law enforcement, established surveillance, confirmed Monroe's location before initiating arrest procedures. This wasn't a suspect who might cooperate peacefully. This was a man who'd already demonstrated willingness to commit murder to solve problems. Authorities approached the situation with appropriate caution and overwhelming force. Monroe's temporary refuge was surrounded systematically. Escape routes were blocked, perimeters established, commands to surrender issued with unmistakable authority. For a moment, Monroe contemplated resisting, perhaps imagining some scenario where flight remained possible. But reality crushed that delusion quickly. He was surrounded, outgunned, cornered completely. He surrendered without violence, emerging with hands raised in ultimate acknowledgement that his freedom had expired. The defiance that had sustained him through nearly 4 weeks as a fugitive evaporated when confronted with unavoidable capture. Marshals placed him in restraints, securing the killer who'd believed himself clever enough to escape consequences permanently. Monroe Betterton was formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder in Jennifer's death. The news of his capture spread rapidly through media outlets and community networks. Jennifer's family received notification with overwhelming relief mixed with renewed grief. Their loved one's killer was in custody, but she remained forever lost. Monroe was transported to jail to await trial. The confidence that had characterized his initial deception had completely dissolved. He sat in holding cells understanding that evidence against him was insurmountable, that his carefully constructed lies had been systematically demolished, that conviction loomed inevitable. During interrogation, Monroe initially attempted to maintain his innocence. He claimed Jennifer had left as he'd always insisted. He suggested her body's presence on their property was somehow explainable through alternative scenarios. He grasped desperately at any narrative that might create reasonable doubt. Investigators responded with evidence. They presented autopsy results proving Jennifer died from homicide, not accident or natural causes. They showed him forensic findings from his home, the blood he'd tried erasing, the disturbed soil where he'd buried his wife, the digital trail documenting his suspicious behavior. They confronted him with timeline inconsistencies, with his flight from jurisdiction, with the overwhelming physical proof contradicting every claim. Monroe's defenses crumbled sequentially under this evidentiary assault. His explanations became increasingly implausible. His confidence eroded into barely concealed panic. He recognized what anyone with basic understanding of criminal justice could see. He had no viable defense. The evidence was comprehensive, devastating, and absolutely conclusive. Faced with overwhelming proof and inevitable conviction, Monroe's legal strategy shifted from denial to mitigation. His attorneys understood that trial would result in guilty verdict with mathematical certainty. The only question worth negotiating was sentencing. Specifically, whether Monroe would face maximum penalties or whether cooperation might earn some minimal consideration. Prosecutors held significant leverage. They could pursue first-degree murder charges if evidence supported premeditation arguments. They could demand maximum sentences without parole possibilities. Or, if Monroe cooperated, providing complete confession, eliminating the need for trial, sparing Jennifer's family the trauma of courtroom testimony, they might consider negotiated resolution. These discussions occurred against the backdrop of Jennifer's family's wishes. They'd endured unimaginable loss. Jennifer's murder, the discovery of her concealed body, weeks of agonizing uncertainty during Monroe's flight, the knowledge that the person they'd welcomed into their family as brother-in-law had destroyed their beloved Jennifer. They deserved justice, deserved resolution, deserved punishment commensurate with Monroe's crime. The legal proceedings advanced methodically through spring and summer 2022. Monroe remained incarcerated throughout, held without bond as flight risk given his demonstrated willingness to flee jurisdiction. His attorneys filed various motions, suppression requests, procedural challenges, desperate attempts to create defense opportunities where none existed. Each motion failed against the weight of evidence compiled against their client. Jennifer's family attended hearings, maintaining dignified presence despite overwhelming grief. They wanted Monroe to see them, to confront the human cost of his violence, to recognize that Jennifer wasn't merely victim but beloved person whose absence devastated those who'd known and loved her. Their presence communicated unmistakable message. Justice would be pursued relentlessly, and Monroe's crime would not be minimized or forgotten. Media coverage remained intense throughout the proceedings. The case contained elements that captured public attention: intimate partner violence, attempted concealment, dramatic manhunt, eventual capture. Local and regional news outlets covered developments extensively, ensuring Monroe's crime remained visible and Jennifer's memory preserved. As trial approached, Monroe's attorneys intensified negotiations with prosecutors. They understood their client's position was hopeless, that conviction was certain if the case proceeded to jury. Their only realistic goal was minimizing sentence through cooperation and guilty plea. They proposed various agreements, each predicated on Monroe accepting responsibility and providing complete confession. Prosecutors evaluated these proposals considering multiple factors: evidence strength, overwhelming; conviction likelihood, certain; family wishes, complex mixture of justice hunger and desire to avoid trial trauma; and Monroe's cooperation level. After extensive deliberation and consultation with Jennifer's family, they determined that negotiated plea agreements served justice more effectively than protracted trial. The proposed agreement required Monroe to plead guilty to second-degree murder, eliminating any claim of innocence or accident. He would provide complete, detailed confession describing Jennifer's murder. He would answer all questions honestly. He would formally acknowledge his guilt and express remorse. In exchange, prosecutors would recommend substantial prison sentence but not pursue maximum available penalties. Jennifer's family confronted agonizing decision. Trial offered opportunity for complete public airing of Monroe's crime, for detailed examination of evidence, for jury's verdict delivering unambiguous condemnation. But trial also meant months of continued proceedings, traumatic testimony about Jennifer's death, reliving horror repeatedly through evidence presentation and cross-examination. The plea agreement promised faster resolution, guaranteed conviction, avoided trial's emotional devastation. After painful deliberation, Jennifer's family supported the negotiated resolution. They wanted Monroe punished, wanted him imprisoned, wanted justice served. But they also wanted peace, wanted closure, wanted to begin healing without months of additional courtroom trauma. Monroe accepted the plea agreement, finally abandoning the lies that had characterized his entire approach to Jennifer's murder. On October 26, 2022, he appeared in court to formally enter his guilty plea. Before the judge, Monroe admitted killing Jennifer, acknowledged concealing her body, confessed to fleeing jurisdiction. His admission came haltingly, without visible remorse, delivered as legal necessity rather than genuine contrition. The court accepted his plea, advancing proceedings to sentencing phase. Jennifer's family prepared victim impact statements, documenting how Monroe's violence had devastated their lives. They would address the court directly, ensuring Monroe heard exactly what his crime had cost, ensuring the judge understood the magnitude of loss Jennifer's murder had inflicted. Monroe had run for 27 days, but running achieved nothing except delaying the inevitable. He'd planned Jennifer's murder meticulously but failed to plan escape with equivalent care. His capture demonstrated fundamental truth about fugitives. Eventually, almost all are caught. The resources available to law enforcement overwhelm individual criminals' capacity to evade indefinitely. Jennifer's killer was in custody, his guilt formally acknowledged, his fate awaiting final determination. The mechanisms of justice ground slowly but inexorably toward resolution. Monroe would face sentencing, receive punishment, spend years imprisoned as consequence for murdering the woman who trusted him absolutely. But no sentence could resurrect Jennifer, could restore what Monroe had destroyed, could adequately compensate for the loss he'd inflicted. Justice in murder cases is always imperfect. Punishment addresses the crime but never repairs the damage. December 16, 2022 arrived with the weight of finality. The sentencing hearing represented culmination of nearly 11 months of investigation, prosecution, and agonizing waiting for Jennifer's family. They assembled in the courthouse, prepared to address Monroe directly through victim impact statements, ready to ensure the judge understood completely what his violence had stolen from their lives. Monroe sat in court wearing standard jail attire, looking diminished compared to the confident killer who'd believed he'd planned the perfect crime. Months of incarceration had eroded his physical presence. More significantly, The psychological burden of captured, exposed, and convicted status had crushed whatever arrogance had sustained him through murdering his wife. The proceedings began with formal recitation of Monroe's crimes: second-degree murder, concealment of a body, obstruction of justice. Each charge carried substantial prison time. Collectively, they represented acknowledgement that Monroe had committed grievous violence, betrayed sacred trust, and attempted to evade accountability through deception and flight. Prosecutors presented comprehensive summary of the case: Jennifer's murder, Monroe's attempted concealment, his fabricated story about her departure, the investigation that exposed his lies, his flight from jurisdiction, and eventual capture. They emphasized the premeditation evident in his actions, the calculated nature of his deception, the complete absence of genuine remorse. Their recommendation: substantial prison sentence reflecting the severity and calculated nature of his crime. Defense attorneys offered mitigating arguments, though their position was fundamentally weak. They suggested Monroe's lack of significant prior criminal record should influence sentencing. They claimed he'd experienced psychological distress that contributed to his actions. They argued that his eventual cooperation through plea agreement demonstrated some capacity for accountability. These arguments rang hollow against the reality of what Monroe had done. He'd murdered his wife of 26 years. He'd buried her body in their yard. He'd lied systematically to everyone. He'd fled when investigation exposed his lies. Nothing about his behavior suggested remorse or reduced culpability. Then Jennifer's family spoke. Lisa Betterton approached the podium with visible emotion barely contained. Her victim impact statement delivered devastating account of Jennifer's character, her kindness, her devotion to family, her trusting nature that Monroe had exploited lethally. Lisa described the horror of Jennifer's disappearance, the anguish of suspecting truth before confirmation, the nightmare of having suspicions validated through discovery of Jennifer's buried body. She spoke directly to Monroe, forcing him to hear what his violence had destroyed. "You murdered someone who loved you, who trusted you completely, who spent 26 years building a life with you. Jennifer deserved protection from you, not murder at your hands. You stole her future, destroyed our family, and demonstrated that the man we thought we knew never actually existed." Other family members followed with similarly powerful statements. Each described Jennifer's irreplaceable presence in their lives, the void her murder had created, the trauma Monroe's actions had inflicted. They spoke of grandchildren who'd lost their grandmother, siblings robbed of their sister, friends devastated by incomprehensible loss. Their collective testimony painted a comprehensive picture of Monroe's crimes' rippling consequences. Throughout these statements, Monroe sat largely impassive. Occasionally his expression flickered with something. Perhaps shame, perhaps merely discomfort at being forced to confront his crime's human cost. But he offered no tears, no visible remorse, no indication that his victim's pain affected him meaningfully. His emotional detachment remained consistent with his character: calculating, self-focused, fundamentally disconnected from others' suffering. The judge listened attentively to all testimony, reviewing case materials and considering appropriate sentence. Multiple factors required balancing: the crime's severity, Monroe's culpability level, the family's suffering, deterrence value, and basic justice principles. Second-degree murder convictions in Virginia carried potential sentences ranging from 5 years to life imprisonment, providing substantial discretion in determining appropriate punishment. The judge addressed Monroe directly before announcing sentence. He noted the breach of trust inherent in intimate partner murder, emphasized that Jennifer's vulnerability to Monroe's violence resulted from the very relationship that should have ensured her safety, and condemned the calculated deception Monroe had employed attempting to conceal his crime. Then came the sentence: 40 years in prison. 40 years for murdering Jennifer. 40 years for betraying 26 years of marriage. 40 years for attempting to make his wife disappear without consequences. The sentence was substantial, ensuring Monroe would spend the majority of his remaining life incarcerated, likely dying in prison given his age at conviction. Jennifer's family received the sentence with mixed emotions. relief that Monroe faced significant punishment, grief that no sentence could restore Jennifer, satisfaction that justice had been served, at least to the extent possible when someone irreplaceable has been murdered. The 40-year sentence wouldn't resurrect Jennifer, but it acknowledged the magnitude of what Monroe had destroyed. Monroe was remanded to Virginia's Department of Corrections to begin serving his sentence immediately. He would be transferred to an appropriate facility where he'd spend decades surrounded by other violent offenders, his freedom permanently revoked, his future reduced to the monotonous routine of long-term incarceration. For Jennifer's family, sentencing represented beginning rather than ending. They faced the ongoing process of grief, of learning to navigate life with Jennifer's permanent absence, of healing from trauma Monroe had inflicted. Her murder had created wound that time might soften but never completely heal. They established memorial funds in Jennifer's name, supporting causes she'd cared about during life, domestic violence prevention, support for families affected by intimate partner violence, education about warning signs of potentially dangerous relationships. Jennifer's death became catalyst for efforts to protect others from similar fates. The case also sparked broader conversations about intimate partner violence, about how trusted partners sometimes transform into lethal threats, about the importance of believing people when they express concerns about their safety. Jennifer had confided unease to friends, had mentioned Monroe's concerning behavior, had manifested subtle distress that those who loved her recognized only in hindsight as warning signs of impending danger. Domestic violence prevention advocates used Jennifer's case to illustrate critical concepts. That violence often escalates, that financial stress frequently triggers domestic abuse, that isolation and control precede physical violence, that the most dangerous time for abuse victims is when they attempt to leave or assert independence. If Jennifer had recognized these patterns, if she'd accessed appropriate resources, might she have survived? These questions haunted those who'd known the Bedtartons. Could Jennifer have been saved through earlier intervention? Were there moments when different responses might have altered outcomes? The retrospective analysis revealed numerous points where help might have been offered, where Jennifer's subtle distress signals might have prompted more aggressive support. But hindsight provides clarity unavailable during events unfolding. Jennifer couldn't have known her husband was planning murder. The signs that seem obvious afterward, Monroe's financial stress, his emotional distance, his calculated behavior, weren't necessarily interpretable as murder precursors while she was living them. Expecting victims to predict their own murders imposes unreasonable burden and misplaces responsibility from perpetrators to victims. Monroe alone bore responsibility for Jennifer's death. His choices, his violence, his deception created this tragedy. Jennifer's only mistake was trusting her husband of 26 years, a trust that should have been safe, that society expects within marriages, that Monroe exploited lethally. The Bedtarton case joined the grim statistics of intimate partner homicide, approximately 1,500 such murders annually in the United States, overwhelmingly involving male perpetrators and female victims. Each statistic represents individual tragedy, family destroyed, person whose potential was violently erased. Jennifer became a name among names, a story among stories, a life among lives stolen by those who should have protected rather than destroyed. Her family worked to ensure she was remembered as more than victim, more than crime statistic. They shared memories of Jennifer's vitality, her kindness, her commitment to those she loved. They posted photographs showing her smile, her engagement with life, her presence before Monroe murdered her. Jennifer deserved memorial focused on who she was, not merely on how she died. Monroe, meanwhile, began his prison sentence in obscurity. Media attention diminished after sentencing. Public interest moved to newer crimes, fresher tragedies. Monroe became another inmate among thousands, his notoriety fading into the background noise of criminal justice system processing. He would spend decades in prison contemplating his choices, or perhaps not contemplating them at all. Some killers use incarceration for genuine reflection and remorse development. Others remain fundamentally unchanged, viewing prison merely as unfortunate consequence rather than deserved punishment. Monroe's internal state remained largely unknown and ultimately irrelevant to justice's completion. What mattered was that Jennifer's murder had been solved, her killer identified and convicted, appropriate punishment imposed. The system had functioned, albeit imperfectly, unable to restore Jennifer but capable of holding Monroe accountable. Her family had received the resolution possible within legal constraints. Not satisfaction, because nothing satisfies the loss of beloved person to murder, but acknowledgement that justice had been pursued and achieved. Years would pass. Monroe would age in prison, his freedom permanently revoked. Jennifer's family would continue healing, processing grief, building new lives incorporating permanent Jennifer-shaped absence. The case would be occasionally remembered when media covered similar crimes or domestic violence awareness campaigns referenced it as cautionary example. But for those who loved Jennifer, time would never fully heal the wound Monroe inflicted. Birthdays would arrive without her presence. Holidays would feel incomplete. Grandchildren would grow up knowing their grandmother only through stories and photographs. Every milestone celebrated would carry undertone of grief, recognition that Jennifer should have been present but Monroe had stolen that possibility. His 40-year sentence acknowledged the magnitude of his crime, but no duration could adequately compensate for the permanence of murder. Jennifer would remain dead regardless of Monroe's punishment length. Her potential, the years she should have lived, the experiences she should have enjoyed, the relationships she should have continued nurturing, was irrevocably erased. Monroe Betterton's name became synonymous with intimate partner betrayal, with the horrifying reality that those we trust most completely can sometimes harbor our destruction. His crime served as reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, that marriage certificates provide no immunity from violence, that trust can be weaponized lethally. Jennifer's story ended in shallow grave, but her memory persisted through those who loved her, through advocacy work undertaken in her name, through the justice pursued on her behalf. She deserved better than she received, deserved to age peacefully, to enjoy grandchildren, to live the future Monroe stole. Instead, she became another name recited at domestic violence memorials, another statistic in tragic tallies, another victim whose death might prevent future tragedies if her story is heard and heeded. Monroe got 40 years. Jennifer got eternity stolen. There is no equivalence in that exchange, no true justice when murder is irreversible. But what justice exists was served. And Jennifer's family could finally begin the long, painful journey toward healing, carrying her memory forward, ensuring she's remembered not merely as victim, but as the vibrant, trusting, beloved person she was before Monroe Betterton destroyed everything. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Hillside Stranglers. When Evil Wore Two Faces, aka the cousin killers who turned Los Angeles into a graveyard. In the autumn of 1977, the City of Angels became a hunting ground where two men wearing masks of normalcy spent their nights transforming young women into silent monuments of their depravity, leaving their broken bodies displayed across hillsides like grotesque warnings that no one was safe. What happens when two cousins discover they share more than blood? When they realize their darkest urges align perfectly, creating a partnership in murder that would claim 10 lives in 4 months. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono didn't just kill together. They constructed an assembly line of torture, a systematic operation of abduction and annihilation that exploited the trust of their victims before subjecting them to unimaginable horrors. These weren't crimes of passion or impulse. These were calculated acts of predation by men who walked among society undetected, who held jobs, paid bills, and smiled at neighbors while perfecting the art of making women disappear. This is the story of how friendship between relatives became a blood pact, how a California hillside became synonymous with terror, and how an entire city held its breath while monsters moved freely through its streets. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi entered the world in Rochester, New York, on May 22, 1951, born into circumstances that foreshadowed the darkness to come. Abandoned by his biological mother, a 17-year-old sex worker, he was adopted at 3 months old by Frances Cialono Bianchi and her husband Nicholas. From his earliest years, Kenneth exhibited troubling behaviors that marked him as different, disturbed, dangerous even in childhood. Frances Bianchi recognized something fundamentally wrong with her adopted son. He fell into trances, staring into nothing with eyes that seemed to see things others couldn't. He wet the bed compulsively well into his elementary years. His rages arrived without warning, explosive episodes where the child became unrecognizable, consumed by fury that seemed disproportionate to any trigger. Medical professionals noted his problems but offered no solutions that stopped the pattern. As Kenneth aged, his issues evolved. He became a prolific liar, weaving elaborate fabrications that demonstrated both creativity and calculation. He stole compulsively, taking items he didn't need simply because he wanted them and believed himself entitled. Teachers reported his inability to focus, his tendency to drift away mentally during lessons, his poor academic performance despite apparent intelligence. Yet Kenneth learned to present a charming facade when beneficial, a skill that would serve him devastatingly well in adulthood. The Bianchi family relocated to California during Kenneth's teenage years, settling in Glendale. There, Kenneth eventually connected with his older cousin Angelo Buono, a man who would recognize and cultivate the malevolence lurking within his younger relative. Angelo, born in 1934, had already established himself as a violent predator by the time Kenneth entered his orbit. Angelo Buono operated an upholstery shop in Glendale, a legitimate business that masked his true nature. He had married multiple times, leaving behind a trail of abused and terrified former spouses who spoke of his explosive temper, his sadistic tendencies, his need to dominate and inflict pain. He bragged openly about assaulting women, treating female bodies as objects designed solely for his violent gratification. Angelo didn't hide his misogyny. He celebrated it, expressed pride in his brutality, viewed cruelty as masculinity. When Kenneth moved to Los Angeles in 1975, he gravitated toward Angelo despite, or perhaps because of, the older man's darkness. Kenneth worked briefly at the upholstery shop, but more significantly, he absorbed Angelo's philosophy regarding women. The younger cousin found validation in Angelo's worldview, discovered someone who wouldn't judge his disturbing urges but would instead encourage their expression. Kenneth attempted to project normalcy. He lived with his girlfriend Kelly Boyd, who gave birth to his son. He worked various jobs, always presenting himself as reliable and pleasant to employers and co-workers. But beneath this manufactured exterior existed a void where empathy should have lived, a hollow space filled only with appetite and contempt. Angelo and Kenneth began spending increasing amounts of time together, their conversations turning toward darker subjects. They discussed fantasies, tested boundaries in their talk, assessed each other's willingness to cross lines that separated thought from action. What they discovered excited them both. They weren't alone in their desires. They had found in each other not just family but kindred spirits in predation. The cousins experimented initially with smaller acts of violation. They posed as police officers, using fake badges to intimidate sex workers, forcing women into their vehicle under threat of arrest before subjecting them to assault. These attacks provided a rehearsal, a testing ground where they refined their methods and confirmed their compatibility as partners in violence. The women they targeted during this period rarely reported the crimes, knowing that complaints from sex workers received minimal attention from actual law enforcement. Emboldened by these successes, Angelo and Kenneth began planning something more elaborate. They would need a location. Angelo's home at 703 East Colorado Street in Glendale would serve that purpose. They would need a method for acquiring victims. Deception and false authority had proven effective. They would need protocols for disposal. The sprawling hills surrounding Los Angeles offered countless remote locations. Most importantly, they needed to select targets carefully, choosing women whose disappearances might generate less immediate investigation. By October 1977, all elements were in place. The cousins had transformed from men who fantasized about murder into men prepared to commit it. They had justified their intentions, convinced themselves of their superiority, eliminated whatever small moral restraints might have previously existed. They were ready. What they created over the following months wasn't simply a series of murders. It was an operation, a system, a partnership that functioned with horrifying efficiency. Angelo provided the location and much of the sadistic creativity. Kenneth contributed youth, charm useful for disarming victims, and enthusiasm for the violence itself. Together they formed something more dangerous than either would have been individually. A collaborative engine of destruction that would claim life after life while authorities scrambled to understand what was happening. The media would eventually dub them the Hillside Stranglers, a name that captured both their method and their dumping ground. But that naming came later, after bodies accumulated, after patterns emerged, after the city descended into panic. In October 1977, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono were simply two cousins spending time together, making plans, preparing for the hunt. No one suspected, no one intervened, and soon, young women would begin disappearing from Los Angeles streets, vanishing into a nightmare from which they would never return. The stage was set. The actors had rehearsed their roles. The first victim had already been selected, though she didn't know it yet, couldn't have imagined as she went about her ordinary day that she had been marked for destruction by men who viewed her not as human but as opportunity. The terror was about to begin, and it would be months before anyone could stop it. Yolanda Washington, a 19-year-old sex worker, became the first to die at the hands of the Hillside Stranglers on October 17, 1977. She climbed into a vehicle near the Sunset Strip, believing she was meeting a client for a transaction that would end with payment and her safe return to the street. Instead, she encountered Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, men who had been prowling for exactly someone like her. Vulnerable, alone, unlikely to be immediately missed. The cousins drove Yolanda not to the location she expected, but to Angelo's residence. There, in a space Angelo had prepared specifically for this purpose, they subjected her to assault and torture. The details of what they inflicted remain partially obscured, known primarily through later confessions that neither cousin provided willingly or completely. What is certain is that Yolanda suffered before she died, that her death came through ligature strangulation, that her killers derived satisfaction from both the process and the result. When they finished, Kenneth and Angelo transported Yolanda's body to a location near the Forest Lawn Cemetery entrance, leaving her displayed on a hillside as though she were refused rather than someone's daughter, someone's friend, a person whose life mattered. Her body was discovered the following morning. Investigators noted the ligature marks, the evidence of sexual assault, the callous disposal. They couldn't have known this was merely the beginning. 2 weeks passed before the cousins struck again. On October 31st, Halloween night, 15-year-old Judith Lynn Miller left home and never returned. Her body surfaced on November 1st near the Verdugo Mountains, another hillside dump site. Judith had been subjected to similar horrors as Yolanda: assault, strangulation, abandonment. The proximity of the murders and the shared characteristics began generating concern among law enforcement, though no clear pattern had yet crystallized. The pace accelerated. On November 6th, Lisa Teresa Caston, a 21-year-old waitress and aspiring actress, vanished after finishing her shift. Kenneth and Angelo had watched her, followed her, waited for the right moment. When they approached, they likely used their police impersonation tactic, the fake badges that had proven so effective. Lisa, believing she was dealing with legitimate officers, complied. Her compliance sealed her fate. At Angelo's residence, Lisa discovered the truth too late. She was bound, assaulted, tortured with an electrical device that the cousins employed to maximize suffering while minimizing external marks that might provide forensic evidence. They strangled her slowly, reviving her multiple times to prolong the terror, to extract maximum gratification from her anguish. When they tired of her suffering, they finished the strangulation and disposed of her body near the Chevy Chase Country Club. She was discovered on November 6th. The murders continued with brutal regularity throughout November. On November 9th, The body of 18-year-old Jane Evelyn King was found near the Golden State Freeway. On November 17th, 28-year-old Christina Weckler's body appeared in the Highland Park area. On November 20th, 14-year-old Sonia Marie Johnson and 12-year-old Dolores and Cepeda were discovered near Dodger Stadium, their small bodies discarded together like broken dolls. Each killing followed a similar template with variations in torture methods that reflected the cousins' evolving creativity in inflicting pain. They experimented with different strangulation techniques. They injected cleaning solution into the bodies of some victims, causing excruciating internal burning before death. They used bags over heads combined with gas piped in to induce panic and suffocation symptoms. They electrocuted victims in sensitive areas. They raped repeatedly. They photographed their victims in various states of distress and violation. Christina Weckler's murder demonstrated the depths of their depravity. A quiet, artistic woman who lived near Angelo's shop, she trusted him as a neighbor. When Angelo knocked on her door with Kenneth, claiming to need to check something in her apartment, she admitted them. They immediately overpowered her, binding and gagging her before transporting her to the Glendale house. There, they subjected Christina to hours of torture, including injecting Windex into her neck and arms while she screamed behind her gag, the chemicals burning through her system, causing agony that lasted until they finally strangled her to death. The murders of Sonia and Dolores particularly horrified the city. Children snatched from a bus stop, two little girls who should have been safe on a Sunday afternoon, taken together and killed together. The cousins showed no remorse, no hesitation in attacking victims so young. If anything, the youth of these victims seemed to provide additional excitement, a further violation of societal boundaries that marked Kenneth and Angelo as monsters beyond redemption. By late November, Los Angeles existed in a state of collective terror. Women refused to walk alone. Parents kept children under constant supervision. The media coverage intensified daily, with newspapers running front-page stories about each new discovery. The killings had become an obsession for both the public and law enforcement. Yet the perpetrators remained ghosts, leaving behind bodies but few solid leads. Lauren Ray Wagner, an 18-year-old student, became another victim on November 28th. She was abducted near her home in the San Fernando Valley, taken to the Glendale location, subjected to the now familiar pattern of assault and torture, then strangled and discarded near Cliff Drive and Cahunga Boulevard. Her parents discovered her body the following morning, a trauma that would destroy their family. On November 29th, Kimberly Diane Martin, a sex worker who advertised through an agency, received a call requesting her services at an apartment in Hollywood. She arrived to find the apartment empty except for Kenneth Bianchi waiting in the darkness. He attacked immediately, subduing her before transporting her to Angelo's house. Kim endured hours of brutalization before the cousins strangled her and left her body on a deserted lot near Alvarado Street. The final Los Angeles victim claimed by the Hillside Stranglers was Cindy Lee Hudspeth, a 20-year-old clerk. On February 16, 1978, after a relative lull in killings that had given the city false hope, Cindy's body was discovered in the trunk of her own vehicle, pushed off a cliff on Angeles Crest Highway. She had been raped, strangled, and disposed of with the same casual cruelty that characterized all the previous murders. 10 women and girls were dead. 10 families were shattered. An entire metropolitan area lived in fear. And despite massive investigative efforts, despite task forces and public appeals and round-the-clock police work, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono remained free, unidentified, uncaught. They had executed their campaign of terror with shocking success, evading detection through a combination of careful planning and shocking luck. But their partnership was fracturing, their relationship strained by paranoia and disagreement about future actions. Kenneth would soon relocate to Washington State, believing he could escape suspicion and possibly continue his crimes independently. That decision would ultimately lead to the unraveling of everything. Kenneth Bianchi arrived in Bellingham, Washington, in May 1978, fleeing Los Angeles not because he feared capture, but because his relationship with Angelo had deteriorated beyond repair. The cousins had argued about methods, about risk, about sharing the spoils of their crimes. Angelo, paranoid and controlling, had become intolerable to Kenneth, who believed himself equally intelligent and capable of continuing the work alone. So Kenneth relocated north, settling into a new life with Kelly Boyd and their son, presenting himself once again as the pleasant, normal man who charmed employers and neighbors. For months, Kenneth maintained his facade successfully. He secured employment with a security company, a position rich with irony given his criminal history. He attended social functions, made friends, projected stability and reliability. Kelly believed she had finally found the version of Kenneth she'd always hoped existed: responsible, present, committed to family. But the urges that had driven him to participate in 10 murders hadn't vanished. They had merely hibernated, waiting for opportunity and isolation to reawaken them. On January 11, 1979, Kenneth accepted an assignment to house sit for a security company supervisor who was traveling. The home was located on Bayside Road in Bellingham, offering privacy and opportunity. Kenneth contacted 2 young women, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder, both university students working part-time jobs to finance their education. He offered them a house-sitting job with generous pay, claiming he needed someone to watch the residents for a few hours. The women, trusting and eager for the income, agreed. Karen and Diane arrived at the Bayside Road address that evening, unaware they had entered the final hours of their lives. Kenneth met them at the door with practiced charm, welcoming them inside, explaining the alleged duties they would perform. But once inside, his demeanor shifted. He revealed his true intentions, producing restraints and a weapon, transforming from friendly employer to predator in seconds. What followed echoed the Los Angeles pattern. Kenneth assaulted both women, strangled them, and attempted to stage the scene to suggest an accident or alternate scenario. But unlike the carefully orchestrated Los Angeles murders executed with Angelo's collaboration, this double homicide was sloppy, rushed, marked by Kenneth's overconfidence and lack of his cousin's meticulous planning. He made critical errors. Witnesses had seen Karen's vehicle near the Bayside address. Kenneth had been observed in the area around the time of the murders. His connection to the victims through the job offer created a direct link. When Karen and Diane's bodies were discovered in the trunk of Karen's car, investigators immediately focused on Kenneth as a suspect. His timeline didn't align with his statements. His explanations crumbled under scrutiny. Within days of the murders, police arrested Kenneth Bianchi, believing they had captured a double murderer. They had no idea they had actually caught half of the most prolific serial killing team in Los Angeles history. During interrogation, Kenneth initially maintained his innocence, constructing elaborate lies, creating alternative narratives. But investigators noticed inconsistencies, contradictions that multiplied with each interview. Forensic evidence from the Bellingham murders directly contradicted Kenneth's version of events. Under increasing pressure, sensing his position was untenable, Kenneth attempted a desperate gambit. He claimed he suffered from multiple personality disorder. He insisted that an alternate personality named Steve Walker had committed the murders, while Kenneth himself remained innocent, unaware of what his other self had done. Kenneth's performance during psychiatric evaluations was theatrical and exaggerated, drawing on popular media depictions of dissociative disorders rather than clinical reality. Some evaluators initially found his presentation convincing, but others recognized the manipulation immediately. Dr. Martin Orne, a psychiatrist and expert in hypnosis, was brought in to evaluate Kenneth's claims. Dr. Orne employed sophisticated testing techniques designed to distinguish genuine dissociative disorders from malingering. He discovered that Kenneth was indeed fabricating, constructing a false personality in hopes of establishing an insanity defense. When confronted with this evidence, Kenneth's carefully constructed performance collapsed. Faced with overwhelming evidence of guilt and the failure of his psychological defense strategy, Kenneth made a calculation. He would confess to the Bellingham murders and, more significantly, reveal his participation in the Los Angeles killings. In exchange, he negotiated for his life, seeking a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty. Prosecutors, desperate for information about the Hillside Strangler case that had remained unsolved for over a year, agreed to negotiate. Kenneth's confessions came slowly, strategically, as he attempted to maintain some leverage in the process. He detailed the Los Angeles murders, describing the methods, the locations, the sequence of events. Most crucially, he identified his partner, Angelo Buono, the cousin who had initiated him into serial murder, who had provided the location and much of the sadistic creativity that defined their crimes. The revelations shocked investigators and the public alike. The Hillside Strangler had been two men all along, working in concert, feeding each other's darkest impulses. Kenneth's confession solved a case that had consumed enormous resources and generated nationwide attention. But it also created a new challenge, building a prosecutable case against Angelo Buono based primarily on Kenneth's testimony, knowing that Kenneth himself was a proven liar with every incentive to minimize his own culpability. Angelo's arrest came in October 1979, more than 20 months after the final Los Angeles murder. He denied everything, claiming Kenneth was fabricating the accusations to reduce his own sentence. Angelo presented himself as a small business owner unjustly accused, a family man targeted by a manipulative relative seeking a scapegoat. The case against Angelo would prove extraordinarily difficult to prosecute. The subsequent legal proceedings became Byzantine in their complexity. The Los Angeles County District Attorney initially charged Angelo with 10 counts of murder. Kenneth, as the star witness, would need to testify against his cousin in exchange for the negotiated plea agreement. But problems emerged immediately. Kenneth's credibility was damaged by his documented history of lying, his failed multiple personality defense, his clear motivation to shift blame. Defense attorneys effectively highlighted these issues, suggesting that Kenneth alone had committed the murders and was now falsely implicating Angelo. Adding further complications, the lead prosecutor Roger Kelly shockingly moved to dismiss all charges against Angelo in 1981, arguing that the case was unwinnable given Kenneth's credibility problems and the lack of significant physical evidence directly linking Angelo to the crime scenes. This decision triggered outrage from victims' families and the public. California Attorney General George Deukmejian intervened, assigning new prosecutors to continue the case over Kelly's objections. The trial finally proceeded with prosecutors presenting Kenneth's detailed confessions, corroborating circumstantial evidence, and testimony from survivors of the cousins' earlier attacks when they had posed as police officers. The defense countered by systematically attacking Kenneth's veracity, emphasizing contradictions in his various statements, highlighting his psychiatric evaluations showing manipulative tendencies. The proceedings dragged on for 2 years, becoming one of the longest criminal trials in California history at that time. Witnesses testified about Angelo's violent history, his abuse of former wives, his openly stated contempt for women. Forensic experts connected trace evidence found at dump sites to materials present in Angelo's home and vehicle. Gradually, despite Kenneth's damaged credibility, the cumulative weight of evidence became overwhelming. On October 31, 1983, exactly 6 years after Judith Lynn Miller's murder on Halloween night 1977, the jury delivered verdicts against Angelo Buono, guilty on 9 counts of murder. The jury could not reach consensus on the 10th charge related to Yolanda Washington, the first victim, due to insufficient evidence beyond Kenneth's testimony specifically connecting Angelo to that killing. But 9 convictions were sufficient. Angelo faced life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Kenneth Bianchi, having fulfilled his cooperation agreement by testifying against Angelo, received the sentences negotiated in his plea deal. Life imprisonment with possibility of parole for the Bellingham murders and a concurrent sentence for the Los Angeles crimes. The agreement spared Kenneth from death row but ensured he would spend decades behind bars before even becoming eligible for parole consideration. The verdicts brought some measure of closure to the victims' families, though closure is perhaps the wrong word for the permanent devastation these crimes inflicted. Parents who lost daughters to the Hillside Stranglers would never fully recover. Siblings grew up in households forever marked by absence and grief. Friends carried survivors' guilt, wondering if different choices on particular days might have saved the women they loved. The communities terrorized during the killing spree had changed fundamentally, losing innocence and trust that could never be fully restored. Angelo Buono served his sentence at Calipatria State Prison, maintaining his innocence despite the convictions. He never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes, never acknowledged the humanity of his victims, never demonstrated anything approximating rehabilitation. On September 21, 2002, at age 67, Angelo died of a heart attack in his cell, ending a life defined by cruelty and violence. His death prompted little public mourning. Victims' family members who learned of his passing expressed relief that he could never be released, never harm anyone again. Kenneth Bianchi remains imprisoned as of this writing, having been denied parole multiple times. During parole hearings, he has alternated between minimizing his role, claiming to have been dominated by Angelo, and expressing what appears to be rehearsed remorse that fails to convince review boards of genuine transformation. Psychological evaluations conducted throughout his incarceration consistently identify him as manipulative, narcissistic, and potentially dangerous. Parole boards have concluded that Kenneth continues to pose an unacceptable risk to public safety. Kenneth's son, born before the murders came to light, grew up knowing his father as a notorious serial killer. Kenneth's relationship with Kelly Boyd disintegrated after his arrest and confession. She had lived with a monster, shared a home with someone capable of unspeakable acts, given birth to the child of a murderer who was simultaneously torturing and killing women across Los Angeles. The psychological trauma of that realization shaped the remainder of her life. The Hillside Strangler case influenced law enforcement practices and criminal justice policies in multiple ways. The investigation's challenges, particularly the difficulty of identifying perpetrators when crimes were committed by a team rather than an individual, led to improved protocols for analyzing serial crimes. Profilers began incorporating the possibility of killer partnerships into their assessments, recognizing that serial murder wasn't always a solitary activity. The case also highlighted vulnerabilities in sex worker communities and runaway populations, groups whose members the cousins specifically targeted because they believed these victims would generate less investigative attention. Advocacy organizations subsequently pushed for policy changes ensuring that crimes against marginalized individuals received equal priority from law enforcement, though implementation of such changes remained incomplete and inconsistent. Media coverage of the Hillside Strangler case established templates that would be replicated in subsequent serial killer reporting. The sensational nickname, the detailed examination of victims' lives, the public fascination with understanding what creates such monsters. This coverage helped educate the public about serial crime, but also risked glorifying perpetrators and traumatizing victims' families through repeated exposure to the details of their loved ones' final hours. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to intrigue researchers studying collaborative violence and the dynamics that enable two individuals to commit acts together that they might not have pursued independently. Kenneth and Angelo's partnership demonstrated how individuals can amplify each other's worst impulses, creating a combined threat greater than either would have posed alone. Their relationship showed how one person's sadistic creativity, Angelo's, combined with another's desire for acceptance and validation, Kenneth's, could produce catastrophic results. Some experts have analyzed the cousins' crimes as reflecting extreme manifestations of misogyny, viewing the systematic targeting and torture of women as gender-based hate crimes executed by men who viewed female bodies as objects to be used and destroyed. This analytical framework helps explain the particular cruelty of the methods employed and the callousness with which victims were discarded. The sites where victims' bodies were discovered have, for some, become informal memorials. Family members occasionally visit these locations, seeking connection with lost loved ones, marking anniversaries of deaths that should never have occurred. The hillsides surrounding Los Angeles, once purely scenic landscape features, carry different associations for those who remember the terror of 1977 and 1978, when each new discovery promised only more heartbreak. Survivors of the cousins' earlier attacks, women who encountered Kenneth and Angelo during their police impersonation phase, who were assaulted but escaped with their lives, live with complex trauma. They know they survived encounters that killed others, that slightly different circumstances would have placed them among the counted dead. Some have shared their experiences publicly, contributing to the historical record and helping explain how the cousins operated. Others have maintained privacy, unwilling to be defined by their victimization. The investigation that eventually caught Kenneth and Angelo involved hundreds of law enforcement personnel working thousands of hours, following countless leads, most of which led nowhere. The detectives who dedicated months or years to the case experienced their own lasting impacts. Nightmares about crime scene photographs, stress-related health problems, relationship difficulties stemming from the emotional weight of the work. Catching the Hillside Stranglers was a professional triumph, but a personal cost for many who made it happen. Public fascination with the Hillside Strangler case has persisted across decades, spawning books, documentaries, television dramatizations, and podcast episodes. This ongoing interest reflects broader cultural preoccupation with serial murder and the question of what creates individuals capable of such acts. The Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono story provides particularly rich material for such examination: family dynamics, complementary psychopathologies, the banality of evil concealed behind ordinary appearances. For the city of Los Angeles, the Hillside Strangler case occupies a particular place in collective memory, alongside other defining crimes that shaped the region's history. The murders occurred during a period when Los Angeles was establishing its identity as a major American metropolis, and the terror they generated became part of the city's narrative, a dark chapter that residents of a certain age remember viscerally. The victims, Yolanda Washington, Judith Miller, Lissa Kasten, Jane King, Christina Weckler, Sonia Johnson, Dolores Cepeda, Lauren Wagner, Kimberly Martin, and Cindy Hudspeth, deserve more than to be remembered primarily as victims of the Hillside Stranglers. They were individuals with dreams, personalities, relationships, futures that should have unfolded. They were daughters, sisters, friends, students, workers, artists, young women navigating life's challenges and opportunities. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono stole those futures, transforming these women into statistics and case files, reducing complex human lives to the circumstances of their deaths. The story of the Hillside Stranglers stands as a testament to human capacity for evil and to the necessity of justice systems that pursue accountability even when cases prove difficult and time-consuming. It demonstrates how monsters can exist undetected among us, how depravity can hide behind masks of normalcy, how evil can be collaborative rather than solitary. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every crime statistic exists a person whose life mattered, whose loss created permanent voids in families and communities, whose memory demands that we never become desensitized to violence or accept brutality as inevitable. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono created a legacy of pain that reverberates still, decades after their capture. The 10 women they murdered remain forever young in photographs, frozen in time, absent from the life events they should have experienced. That absence constitutes their true crime, not the specifics of torture methods or body disposal sites, but the simple, devastating fact of lives ended before they had truly begun, potential extinguished by cruelty, future stolen by men who viewed murder not as the ultimate transgression but as entertainment and self-gratification. That is the horror at the heart of the Hillside Strangler case, the thing that should disturb us most, the reason these crimes must be remembered and examined and never forgotten. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Staten Island Ripper. When a drifter's smile hit a graveyard. Some men collect stamps. Richard Beegenwald collected corpses. Between 1958 and 1983, he didn't just kill, he curated death itself. We're tracking a predator who turned New Jersey's forgotten spaces into his personal hunting preserve. But understanding this killer means descending into a darkness so complete, so methodical, that even veteran homicide detectives would wake screaming decades after closing his case. Richard Beegenwald didn't snap one terrible night. He was born broken, sharpened by violence, and released into society again and again like some administrative error made flesh. The bodies he left behind weren't just victims. They were warnings nobody read until the death count became impossible to ignore. Richard Biegenwald entered this world on August 24, 1940, in Rockland County, New York, and if evil has a birthplace, perhaps it started there in the chaos of an unwanted pregnancy. His mother couldn't stand the sight of him from the beginning. Not the normal exhaustion of new motherhood, but something colder, more fundamental. She looked at her infant son and saw something wrong, something she wanted to send back. Before Richard turned 2, his mother had already made her decision. She handed him over to the foster care system like defective merchandise, and what followed was a childhood that reads like a manual for creating a serial killer. The foster homes changed, but the theme remained constant. Rejection, brutality, indifference. He bounced between families who saw him as a paycheck at best, a punching bag at worst. The few records that survived from his early years paint a portrait of a boy who learned quickly that human connection meant pain, that trust was for people stupid enough to believe the world had room for mercy. By age 5, Richard was lighting fires. Small ones at first, testing boundaries, watching things burn with the focused intensity other children reserved for toys. The foster parents noticed but did nothing. By 7, he'd graduated to torturing animals, a classic warning sign that every criminology textbook now recognizes, but that nobody seemed to care about in post-war America when troubled boys were just acting out. He'd trap cats in the neighborhood, and what he did to them in the privacy of tool sheds and garages would be discovered only later, when investigators tried to trace the origins of his pathology. School was a battleground where Richard learned he enjoyed hurting people. He wasn't the biggest kid or the strongest, but he had something others lacked, an absolute absence of the brake pedal most humans have when it comes to violence. Other kids would stop at a bloody nose. Richard wouldn't stop until someone pulled him off, and even then, his eyes held something that made teachers step back. Cold, calculating, already gone somewhere normal people couldn't follow. His teenage years accelerated the descent. At 13, Richard was arrested for the first time. Assault with a deadly weapon after he attacked another boy with a knife over an imagined slight. The juvenile system swallowed him briefly, then spit him back out with a file marked disturbed, but no real intervention. Nobody connected the dots between the animal torture, the fires, the escalating violence. Or if they did, they didn't care enough to stop what was coming. At 16, Richard dropped out of school entirely. Why bother? He'd found his real education on the streets of Staten Island, where he drifted after aging out of his last foster placement. He took odd jobs, dishwasher, laborer, anything that required no credentials and asked no questions. But work bored him. What fascinated Richard was the power dynamic of predator and prey, the moment when someone realized they'd made a fatal mistake trusting him. He stalked the margins of society, picking up survival skills from other drifters, learning which abandoned buildings offered the best privacy, which neighborhoods had the worst police response times. Richard was building an education in murder without yet committing the act itself. Studying, preparing, waiting for the moment when opportunity and impulse would collide. That moment came in 1958 when Richard was just 18 years old. His name was Stephen Sladowski, a grocer in Bayonne, New Jersey. Richard walked into his store late one evening when the owner was closing up. The official story said it was a robbery gone wrong, but the way Richard shot Sladowski, execution style, close range, looking him in the eyes, suggested something more personal, more deliberate. Richard took $40 from the register. $40 for a human life. But money wasn't really the point. The point was discovering that he could do it, that crossing that final line from fantasy to reality felt not like a descent into madness but like coming home. Richard was arrested within days. He was sloppy, young, unrefined in his methodology. The trial was swift. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison. At 18, Richard Biegenwald's killing career should have ended before it truly began. Instead, the system made a decision that would cost dozens of lives. Trenton State Prison became Richard's graduate school in violence. He didn't languish there, he thrived. He learned from older convicts how to hide contraband, how to read people's weaknesses, how to manipulate the system. He pumped iron until his lean frame became something harder, more dangerous. He studied law books not out of any desire for justice, but to find loopholes, technicalities, ways to game parole boards and appeal processes. And incredibly, impossibly, the system that locked him away for life began opening the door. After serving just 17 years for execution-style murder, Richard Biegenwald was paroled in 1975. The parole board looked at his file and saw a model prisoner who'd taken classes, stayed out of trouble, expressed remorse. They didn't see, or chose not to see, the predator behind the performance. Richard had learned the most important lesson prison could teach: how to tell people what they wanted to hear while planning what he wanted to do. He walked out of Trenton State Prison at age 34, supposedly rehabilitated, theoretically reformed. The parole conditions were standard: regular check-ins, maintain employment, no criminal activity. Richard nodded along, signed the papers, and immediately began planning his next hunt. Because that's what freedom meant to Richard Biegenwald: not a second chance at life, but a second chance at death. He settled in the Staten Island, New Jersey border area, a geographic margin that matched his social existence. He picked up odd jobs, just enough to satisfy his parole officer. He rented cheap rooms in buildings where neighbors didn't ask questions. And he started prowling. The late 1970s and early 1980s in that region meant runaway teenagers, hitchhikers, sex workers, drifters, people society had already forgotten before Richard erased them completely. He understood instinctively that successful serial killing requires victim selection as much as murder technique. Choose people nobody would miss. Choose people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive manhunts. Choose the already invisible and make them permanently gone. Richard developed a pattern, though calling it a pattern requires recognizing the chaos he created. He'd spot potential victims and offer help. A ride, a place to crash, food, drugs. His appearance helped. Average height, unremarkable features, a face that could be kind when he needed it to be. He looked like someone's sad uncle, not a killer. That mask of normalcy was Richard's most effective weapon. What happened after victims accepted his help varied only in the specific horrors inflicted. Richard's preferred method was shooting. Quick, efficient, distanced enough to avoid blood spray while intimate enough to watch the light leave their eyes. But he wasn't rigid in his methodology. Strangulation, stabbing, blunt force trauma. He'd use whatever tools and methods the situation demanded. The killing itself was the constant. The method was just logistics. And the bodies? Richard had learned from his first sloppy murder. Now he chose disposal sites with care. Isolated wooded areas, abandoned properties, places where discovery might take months or years if it happened at all. He understood decomposition, how weather and wildlife would destroy evidence. He knew that a missing person wasn't a murder investigation, not until someone found remains. Between 1975 and 1982, Richard Biegenwald killed and killed and killed, refining his craft with each murder. How many victims? Even he probably couldn't have said with certainty. Some he remembered. Others blurred together in a catalog of death that lost individual meaning after a certain point. Richard Biegenwald's killing grounds spread across New Jersey like a cancer metastasizing through forgotten spaces. He discovered something crucial during his post-parole murder spree. America has countless places where bodies can disappear, where the missing become permanent ghosts. Every state has them. The wooded lots awaiting development that never comes. The industrial sites abandoned to rust and decay. The patches of wilderness caught between highways where nobody walks except people trying to vanish. He particularly favored the areas around Staten Island and coastal New Jersey, regions he knew from his youth, places where he understood the rhythms of police patrols and the habits of locals. Richard wasn't randomly dumping bodies. He was creating an invisible cemetery, a distributed graveyard scattered across miles of terrain that might never be fully mapped. His victim selection showed cunning that made prosecution harder even when authorities finally understood what they were hunting. Anna Olesiewicz was 17 when Richard killed her in 1982, a troubled teenager who'd run away from home and was trying to hitchhike her way to somewhere better. She accepted a ride from a middle-aged man who seemed harmless. Her remains would later be discovered in a shallow grave near an abandoned property Richard had access to, but not before months had passed and evidence had degraded. William Ward was 18, drifting through New Jersey after aging out of foster care. Richard's own background, which perhaps made Ward's murder particularly cruel or particularly inevitable. Ward disappeared one autumn night after last being seen getting into a vehicle matching the description of Richard's car. His body was found months later in woods off a rural highway, decomposed beyond easy identification. Only dental records confirmed who he'd been. Deborah Osborne was just 17, another runaway from a broken home who thought she'd found someone offering help. Richard shot her and disposed of her body with the same methodical care he'd bring to any routine task. Her remains were discovered near the same property where Anna Olesiewicz had been buried, suggesting Richard had favorite dumping grounds he returned to again and again. John Petrone was 31, older than Richard's typical victim profile, which showed the killer's evolving confidence. Petrone wasn't a runaway or a drifter, but a small-time drug dealer who'd crossed paths with Richard in the criminal underworld of Staten Island. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed, but his body was eventually found buried in the garage of a property Richard had access to. A crucial mistake that would eventually help authorities build their case. But these names, these confirmed victims, represent only the murders investigators could prove. The true body count haunted detectives then and continues to haunt cold case investigators now. How many others disappeared into Richard's invisible cemetery? How many families never got answers about missing daughters and sons who'd last been seen in the areas where Richard hunted? The geographic spread of the disposal sites revealed Richard's methodology. He wasn't creating a concentrated killing field like some serial murderers. Instead, he distributed his victims across a wide area, reducing the likelihood that someone would notice a pattern. Each body was a separate mystery, a distinct missing persons case. The connections existed only in Richard's mind until investigators finally started putting pieces together. What made Richard particularly dangerous was his understanding of victim vulnerability. He targeted people already on society's margins, individuals whose disappearances might be noticed by family but wouldn't trigger massive law enforcement responses. Runaways, foster kids, sex workers, drifters, small-time criminals. These were his preferred prey. People who existed in the shadows, whose movements were erratic, whose absences could be explained away as voluntary departures rather than violent abductions. The properties Richard used for disposal showed careful planning. He didn't randomly dump bodies along roadsides where they'd be quickly discovered. Instead, he sought out locations where he had legitimate access or could enter without drawing attention. The garage where Petrone was buried belonged to a house Richard had connections to through acquaintances. The wooded areas where other victims were found were near properties he'd worked at or visited regularly. Richard was creating a network of death that followed the map of his daily life. And he was getting away with it, month after month, year after year, while the body count climbed and families prayed for children who were already buried in unmarked graves. The breakthrough that would eventually unravel Richard's invisible cemetery came not from brilliant detective work, but from the kind of random chance that makes investigators simultaneously grateful and furious. In 1982, a part-time police officer named William Lucia was moonlighting at a jewelry store when Richard walked in late one night to sell some items. Lucia, whose instincts were sharper than his job description suggested, noticed something off about the transaction. The jewelry seemed inconsistent with Richard's appearance and manner. Lucia stalled the sale and ran Richard's information. What came back was a parole violator with a murder conviction, out after serving only 17 years of a life sentence and now attempting to fence items that might be connected to recent disappearances. Lucia made the arrest on the parole violation, initially unaware he'd just caught one of New Jersey's most prolific serial killers. The initial interrogation went nowhere. Richard was experienced enough to know that saying nothing was always the safest strategy. He sat across from detectives with dead eyes and refused to engage. But while Richard stayed silent, investigators began pulling threads. The jewelry he'd tried to fence matched items reported missing by families of several disappeared teenagers. Richard's residence, a depressing apartment that smelled of decay and neglect, yielded troubling discoveries. Investigators found personal effects belonging to multiple missing persons. Identification cards, jewelry, scraps of clothing. Most damningly, they found firearms that ballistics would eventually match to bullets recovered from several victims' remains. But Richard's most catastrophic mistake was his failure to properly distance himself from his disposal sites. The garage where John Patrone was buried belonged to Darren Fitzgerald, Richard's girlfriend at the time, a woman who'd turned her home into an auxiliary facility for Richard's hobbies. When investigators searched the property with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they found Patrone's remains and evidence suggesting other bodies had been stored there temporarily before being moved to more permanent graves. Fitzgerald, facing conspiracy and accessory charges, made the calculation countless accomplices have made throughout criminal history: testify against the monster or go down with him. She chose survival, and her testimony opened a window into Richard's post-parole activities that was both horrifying and invaluable for prosecution. She described how Richard would come home with blood on his clothes, how he'd disappear for hours and return exhausted, how he'd casually mention taking care of problems without elaboration. She described finding items in their home that clearly didn't belong to them: a teenager's jacket, a wallet with someone else's ID, a watch still keeping time on a wrist that had stopped moving. She described the moment she'd understood what her boyfriend actually did during his absences and the paralyzing fear that kept her silent until arrest made honesty the only path to survival. As Fitzgerald talked, investigators began connecting Richard to a growing list of disappearances and unsolved murders. The geographic pattern emerged: Staten Island to coastal New Jersey, following Richard's movements over 7 years of freedom. The victim profile clarified: young, vulnerable, trusting of a man who presented himself as helpful rather than harmful. Search teams fanned out across Richard's hunting grounds, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and old-fashioned grid searches of areas Richard had been known to frequent. What they found turned suspected serial killer into confirmed one. Anna Olesiewicz remains came from a shallow grave near an abandoned property. Deborah Osborne was found in woods Richard had walked through regularly. William Ward's body was recovered from a rural dumping ground along a highway Richard used frequently. Each discovery added another charge, another family notified, another piece of evidence that Richard Biegenwald had spent his freedom doing exactly what everyone should have known he'd do: killing. Richard Biegenwald's trial began in 1983, and from the opening statements, observers understood they were witnessing something unusual in the annals of American justice. Most serial killer trials focus on proving the defendant committed specific murders. Richard's trial focused on preventing him from ever having the opportunity to kill again. The charges were stacked: multiple counts of first-degree murder, weapons violations, abuse of corpse, and conspiracy. The prosecution wasn't seeking a conviction. They were seeking permanent removal from society. The courtroom in Monmouth County became theater of the macabre. Lead prosecutor possessed a file so thick with evidence, testimony, and horror that simply reading the charges consumed nearly an hour. Richard sat at the defense table looking like what he'd always been: utterly ordinary, the kind of middle-aged man you'd pass on any street without a second glance. That ordinariness was perhaps his most frightening characteristic. Evil that looks like evil is easy to identify and avoid. Evil that looks like everybody else requires constant vigilance nobody can maintain. The prosecution's strategy was methodical: establish pattern, prove opportunity, demonstrate means, show consciousness of guilt through disposal methodology. They began with Anna Olesiewicz, the 17-year-old runaway whose family had spent months hoping she'd simply chosen not to come home. Medical examiner testimony detailed the cause of death: gunshot wound to the head, execution style, the angle suggesting the victim had been kneeling or lying down when shot. Ballistics matched the bullet to a firearm recovered from Richard's residence. Then came the personal effects found in Richard's apartment: Anna's student ID, jewelry matching descriptions provided by her family, scraps of clothing consistent with what she'd been wearing when last seen. The defense argued this was circumstantial, that possession didn't equal murder. The prosecution countered with Darren Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald's testimony riveted the courtroom. She described Richard's behavior in the days around Anna's disappearance. His absence during specific hours, his return with clothes that needed immediate washing, his casual mention of solving a problem. She described finding Anna's jewelry in Richard's belongings and his explanation that he'd acquired it through unnamed means. Most damningly, she described Richard's total lack of effect when discussing missing teenagers whose faces appeared on news broadcasts. Where normal people expressed concern or sympathy, Richard showed nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just a void where emotion should exist. The defense attempted to discredit Fitzgerald as a woman facing her own criminal charges who'd say anything to avoid prison. But her testimony had the ring of truth that coach statements lack. She wasn't embellishing or dramatizing. She was describing life with a serial killer from the perspective of someone who'd slowly realized the man sharing her bed was something monstrous and had been too terrified to act on that knowledge until arrest forced her hand. The prosecution moved through the victim list. William Ward, Deborah Osborne, John Patrone. Each murder followed similar patterns. Victim selection targeting the vulnerable, method of killing showing no mercy, disposal demonstrating premeditation and concealment. The composite picture that emerged was of a predator so methodical, so practiced, that murder had become routine business rather than passionate crime. Forensic evidence supported the prosecution's narrative. Decomposition patterns on the recovered remains suggested victims had been killed and buried within similar timeframes. Soil analysis from burial sites matched soil found in Richard's vehicle. Fiber evidence connected victims to locations Richard frequented. The web of physical evidence was supplemented by witness testimony from individuals who'd seen Richard with various victims shortly before their disappearances. But the prosecution faced challenges that haunt any serial killer trial. Proving not just that murders occurred, but that this specific defendant committed them. Defense attorneys hammered away at gaps in the physical evidence, pointing out that decomposition had destroyed potential DNA evidence, that witness identifications were unreliable, that Fitzgerald's testimony was motivated by self-interest. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Other inmates at the county jail where Richard was held during trial. He'd made the fatal mistake many incarcerated killers make, he talked. Not confessions exactly, but boasts, hints, admissions disguised as hypothetical conversations. Inmates described Richard's descriptions of his methods, his victim selection criteria, his disposal techniques. Each inmate testimony added another layer to the portrait of a serial killer who couldn't help but share his expertise even when silence would have served him better. One inmate described a conversation where Richard had outlined his philosophy, that society created victims by marginalizing people, and that he was simply cleaning up the human debris nobody else cared about. The chilling logic that murder was social sanitation revealed Richard's self-justification for his crimes. He wasn't a killer in his own mind. He was a problem solver, removing inconvenient people from a world that had already decided they didn't matter. Another inmate testified that Richard had described his disposal methods with the detachment of someone discussing carpentry techniques. The depth of graves necessary to slow decomposition. The importance of selecting wooded areas where soil disturbance wouldn't be obvious. The wisdom of removing jewelry and identification before burial to complicate identification. Richard had treated murder as a craft requiring skill and refinement, and his jailhouse conversations revealed an expert discussing his field of specialization. The defense attempted to suppress these inmate testimonies, arguing they were unreliable jailhouse snitches trading lies for reduced sentences. But the consistency of their accounts, combined with details that matched investigative findings, gave them credibility. Richard hadn't just killed. He'd needed to share his accomplishments with someone, and that compulsion had provided investigators with the final pieces of their puzzle. As the trial progressed, something unusual happened in the courtroom. The families of confirmed victims attended daily, sitting in rows behind the prosecution, their presence a silent testimony to the human cost of Richard's freedom. But other families also appeared. Parents and siblings of people who disappeared during Richard's post-parole years. cases that couldn't be definitively connected to him, but that shared troubling similarities to the proven murders. These families didn't testify. They simply bore witness, hoping that Richard's conviction might finally provide answers to their own unresolved losses. The prosecution couldn't include these suspected cases in the charges. Insufficient evidence, lack of remains, unbridgeable gaps in the investigative chain. But everyone in that courtroom understood that the 9 murders Richard was being tried for represented only the confirmed deaths, not the actual body count. The defense strategy was surprisingly straightforward: create reasonable doubt through challenging each piece of evidence individually. They couldn't claim Richard was innocent. The physical evidence and testimony were overwhelming. Instead, they argued that the prosecution hadn't proven each specific murder beyond reasonable doubt, that circumstantial evidence required assumptions and inferences that might not be justified. But reasonable doubt requires an alternative explanation for the evidence, and the defense couldn't provide one. Why did Richard possess items belonging to murdered victims? Why did ballistics match his weapons to bullets recovered from remains? Why did his girlfriend describe behavior consistent with serial murder? Why did inmates report jailhouse admissions? The cumulative weight of evidence crushed any possibility of innocent explanation. Richard himself never testified, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. His attorneys advised silence, knowing that putting him on the stand would invite prosecution questions he couldn't answer without either lying obviously or admitting guilt. So Richard sat silent through weeks of testimony. His face registering nothing as witness after witness described his murders in technical detail. The prosecution's closing argument lasted 3 hours, a systematic review of every piece of evidence pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Richard Biegenwald was a serial killer who'd spent his parole period murdering vulnerable people and disposing of their bodies with methodical precision. The prosecutor reminded jurors of the parole board's decision to release Richard after just 17 years, noted that he'd immediately resumed killing, and emphasized that the only acceptable verdict was one ensuring he'd never have the opportunity to hurt anyone ever again. The defense's closing was briefer, arguing that circumstantial evidence required the jury to speculate and infer, that the prosecution's case was built on testimony from compromised witnesses and physical evidence that didn't definitively prove Richard's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It was a professional argument delivered competently, but everyone in the courtroom could hear the lack of conviction behind the words. Even Richard's own attorneys seemed to understand they were going through motions rather than mounting a genuine defense. The jury deliberated for less than 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of first-degree murder. When the foreman read the verdicts, Richard's expression didn't change. No surprise, no relief, no fear. Just the same flat effect he displayed throughout the trial. He'd always known how this would end. The trial was theater, the verdict inevitable. What happened next was simply administrative processing of a foregone conclusion. Richard Biegenwald's sentencing hearing in 1983 should have been straightforward. Multiple murder convictions carried mandatory life sentences, and New Jersey still maintained the death penalty at that time for particularly heinous crimes. The prosecution argued for death, citing the multiple victims, the calculated nature of the crimes, and the absolute certainty that Richard would kill again if ever given the opportunity. The defense argued for life imprisonment, citing Richard's troubled childhood, his mental state, and opposition to capital punishment on principle. The judge's decision reflected the complicated reality of capital punishment in America. Richard received multiple life sentences plus additional time for related charges, to be served consecutively with no possibility of parole. The death penalty, despite being technically available, wasn't imposed, whether due to legal technicalities, judicial philosophy, or simple acknowledgement that multiple life sentences would achieve the same result is unclear from the record. What was clear? Richard Biegenwald would die in prison, and everyone involved in the case understood that this outcome was justice delayed, not justice achieved. True justice would have been keeping him imprisoned after his first murder in 1958 instead of releasing him to kill at least 9 more times and possibly many more. Richard was transferred to New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, the same facility where he'd served time for his first murder decades earlier. The symmetry was noted by investigators and families alike. The killer had come full circle, back to where he'd studied and prepared for the murder spree that defined his life. Prison officials classified Richard as a maximum security inmate requiring special management. He was housed in a unit reserved for the most dangerous prisoners, including other murderers and individuals with violent histories. Even among this population, Richard maintained the same flat affect and minimal engagement that characterized his courtroom presence. He wasn't hostile or aggressive toward other inmates. He simply existed, going through the routines of prison life with the same detachment he'd shown toward his victims. But the story didn't end with Richard's imprisonment. Investigators continued working his case, knowing that the 9 confirmed murders represented only the provable deaths, not the actual toll. Cold case detectives reviewed unsolved disappearances and murders from Richard's areas of operation during his parole period, searching for connections that might have been missed during the initial investigation. The frustrating reality of serial killer investigations is that some victims are never identified. Some cases are never definitively solved. Richard wasn't talking. He'd maintained silence from arrest through trial and continued that pattern in prison. Without his cooperation, connecting him to additional murders required physical evidence that often didn't exist. Families of missing persons from that era haunted police departments, bringing photographs and desperate questions. Could Richard have killed their daughter, their son, their sister? Investigators did their best to investigate each possibility, comparing disappearance locations and dates with Richard's known movements, searching for physical evidence linking him to suspected victims. Some investigations led nowhere. Others resulted in strong suspicions but insufficient proof for prosecution. The broader questions raised by Richard's case troubled everyone involved in the criminal justice system. How had a man convicted of execution-style murder been paroled after just 17 years? What failures in the assessment process had allowed Richard to convince a parole board he was rehabilitated when he was simply lying more effectively? How many other killers had been released due to similar failures, and how many more people had died as a result? These weren't academic questions. They represented systemic failures with body counts attached. The parole board that released Richard in 1975 had made a decision that cost at least 9 lives and possibly many more. The parole officers who supervised him after release had missed warning signs or hadn't looked hard enough for them. The system designed to protect society from dangerous individuals had instead provided Richard with fresh hunting grounds. Reform efforts followed Richard's conviction, as they often do after high-profile serial killer cases. Parole guidelines were tightened for violent offenders. Supervision protocols were enhanced. Risk assessment tools were developed to better identify dangerous individuals masquerading as reformed inmates. But these reforms came too late for Anna Olesiewicz, William Ward, Deborah Osborne, John Petrone, and all the others who'd crossed paths with Richard during his years of freedom. Richard's prison years were unremarkable in the way that maximum security confinement tends to be for compliant inmates. He didn't escape or attempt to escape. He didn't assault guards or other inmates. He simply served his time day after day, year after year, in a small cell that represented the permanent cage society should have kept him in decades earlier. Occasionally, investigators would visit, hoping that time and the certainty of never leaving prison might loosen Richard's tongue. They'd sit across from him in interview rooms and ask about unsolved cases, showing photographs of missing persons, describing disappearances that matched his methodology. Richard would look at the photos with the same dead eyes that had watched his victims die, say nothing of value, and return to his cell. Whatever satisfaction he derived from his murders, sharing details wasn't part of it. The families of confirmed victims found themselves in a peculiar position. Grateful that Richard was imprisoned, frustrated that so many questions remained unanswered. They knew the basics, how their loved ones had died, where they'd been found, that justice had been served through conviction and imprisonment. But the human desire for complete understanding, why their child, what Richard's motive was, whether their loved one had suffered, these questions went unanswered because Richard refused to provide answers. Victim advocacy groups that formed in response to Richard's case pushed for reforms that would give families more information and more involvement in the criminal justice process. Victims' rights legislation that passed in subsequent years owed some of its momentum to the frustrations expressed by the families of Richard's victims. People who discovered that conviction and imprisonment didn't necessarily bring the closure they'd hoped for. Richard's health declined in the late 1990s, the inevitable result of aging in a maximum security environment with limited health care and decades of poor habits. He developed the chronic conditions that plague elderly inmates: heart disease, diabetes, respiratory problems. Prison medical staff treated these conditions with the basic care the system provided, but nobody was particularly invested in extending Richard's life beyond what nature allowed. In March 2008, Richard Biegenwald died in prison at age 67. The official cause of death was listed as complications from chronic health conditions, heart failure, respiratory failure, the systemic breakdown that comes with decades of declining health. He died in the prison hospital ward, alone, unmourned by anyone except perhaps investigators who'd hoped he might eventually provide answers about suspected victims. His death drew minimal media coverage. A brief obituary in local newspapers noted his passing and his conviction for multiple murders, but by 2008, Richard was old news, a relic from an earlier era of serial killing before the proliferation of DNA evidence and advanced forensic techniques. Younger generations didn't know his name. Even among true crime enthusiasts, Richard was obscure compared to more famous serial killers whose cases had received extensive media coverage and spawned books and documentaries. The families of his confirmed victims received notification of his death through victim services coordinators. Their reactions varied: relief that the monster was finally gone, frustration that he died without providing complete answers, sadness that his death didn't undo the losses they'd experienced. Some families had spent decades rebuilding lives shattered by Richard's violence. His death represented an endpoint, but not necessarily closure. Richard Biegenwald was cremated in a prison facility, his ashes disposed of in an unmarked location. No funeral, no memorial, no gravestone marking his existence. He'd spent his life creating an invisible cemetery for his victims. The state returned the favor by ensuring his own burial was equally anonymous. In death as in life, Richard was ultimately unremarkable. An average-looking man who'd done monstrous things. A killer whose name didn't enter the pantheon of infamous serial murderers despite a body count that rivaled better-known predators. His obscurity was perhaps the final insult to his ego. He'd killed repeatedly, evaded capture for years, created a trail of devastation across New Jersey and Staten Island, and his ultimate legacy was being forgotten by everyone except the families whose lives he destroyed. But those families remember. Anna Olesiewicz relatives still gather on her birthday to commemorate the life cut short at 17. William Ward's foster siblings created a memorial scholarship for other kids aging out of the system, turning tragedy into something constructive. Deborah Osborne's mother spent years advocating for runaway prevention programs, hoping to protect other vulnerable teenagers from predators like Richard. These memorial efforts represent the real legacy of Richard's crimes. Not his body count or his methodology, but the ripples of trauma and loss that continue spreading decades after the murders occurred. Families who lost children to Richard's violence are still healing, still processing, still trying to understand how a system designed to protect society instead unleashed a killer who'd already demonstrated his lethal potential. The cold case investigations continue even now, though Richard's death eliminated the possibility of additional prosecutions or confessions. Forensic genealogy and improved DNA analysis techniques offer hope that some unidentified victims from that era might finally be identified and connected to known cases. These technical advances come too late to prosecute Richard, but they might provide answers to families who've spent decades wondering what happened to missing loved ones. Richard Biegenwald's story is ultimately about systemic failure with a catastrophic body count. A troubled child became a teenage killer who served minimal time, was released despite obvious danger, and used his freedom to murder at least 9 people and possibly many more. Every stage of the system that should have protected society, foster care, juvenile justice, criminal prosecution, parole boards, supervision officers, failed in ways that enabled additional deaths. The lessons from Richard's case were written in blood: that childhood warning signs matter, that some individuals lack the capacity for rehabilitation, that parole decisions carry life and death consequences, that victim selection determines whether serial killers are caught quickly or kill for years undetected. These lessons have informed reforms and changes in criminal justice policy, but they came too late for the victims buried in Richard's invisible cemetery. The monster is dead. The damage remains permanent, and somewhere in New Jersey, there may be unmarked graves still waiting to be discovered, final victims of a predator society released and forgot about until the body count became impossible to ignore. Some men collect stamps. Richard Beegenwald collected corpses. In the end, his collection numbered at least 9 confirmed pieces, with suspected additions that may never be confirmed. He didn't just kill, he curated death itself, turning forgotten people into permanent ghosts. That was his art, his obsession, his legacy. And when he finally died in a prison hospital bed at 67, the only eulogy that mattered was silence. The same silence he'd imposed on victims who'd made the fatal mistake of accepting help from a man whose smile hid a graveyard. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.